Chapter 4:13. It was common to feel emotional about the sea, but it was rare to feel emotional about salted fish. However, when he thought about what had happened to him in the past year, even though he was facing a basket of salted fish, Long Qing could not help but sigh. However, he was very clearly aware that any emotions like sighing and sighing with emotion were too unnecessary to him right now. Moreover, it would cause his mind that had just calmed down with great difficulty to once again feel the pain and despair that was difficult to restrain. So, he silently prepared to leave the fishing port. Suddenly he stopped in his tracks. His exquisite leather shoes pressed against the wet and slippery ground as he slowly turned his body around. He saw a boat rising and falling in the waves in the distance, which was full of morning light. Long Qing's eyes were still much sharper than ordinary people's, and he saw a Taoist in indigo standing on the boat. The Taoist in indigo on the boat looked ordinary and there was nothing special about him, but he couldn't move his eyes away because his body became extremely stiff because of the shock. Fishermen and coolies carried heavy catches on their backs and walked through the slippery deck. On the shore, merchants were smoking cigarettes and shouting arrogantly. Seabirds were flying back and forth between the surface of the sea and the ship's mast. The fishing port of Yu country was busy and noisy as usual. It seemed that no one had seen that small boat. Long Qing silently looked at the boat and the Taoist on the boat from a distance of hundreds of feet. His eyes were uneasy with the ups and downs of the waves in the distance. He was not a cultivator now, but he still had his insight. It was clear that the Taoist in indigo must be a cultivator, and he couldn't see through him at all. Even he who was once powerful couldn't see through him. The Taoist in indigo on the boat in the distance stood at the bow of the boat with his hands behind his back. He slightly raised his head to look at the rising sun in the east, and his whole body seemed to melt in the reddish morning light. Looking at the back of the Taoist in indigo, Long Qing suddenly had an impulse to run away. At this moment, a calm but oppressive voice sounded in his mind. Is there really such a thing as satisfaction in the world? The Taoist in indigo on the distant sea did not turn around, so he couldn't see whether he spoke or not. But Long Qing knew that the voice in his mind was the Taoist's question. Hearing this question, his handsome eyebrows slightly frowned, and he seemed to be in pain. He lowered his head to look at a struggling shrimp in the mucus at his feet, and murmured, "What can I do if I can't be satisfied?" Then, he raised his head and looked at the Taoist in indigo on the boat in the distance. With some resentment and frustration, he said, "The light has abandoned itself, and the darkness disdains to kill itself. What right do a good-for-nothing like me have to complain? What kind of life can I hope for?" The Taoist's voice sounded again in Long Qing's mind from thousands of feet away. "You have experienced so many things in the past year, but you still don't understand the real relationship between light and darkness. You've experienced so many things in the past year. Don't tell me you still don't understand the true relationship between light and darkness?" Long Qing thought of the dream when he was climbing the mountain in the academy. It was a dream that made him extremely painful, proud, glorious, and ultimately frustrated. Thinking of the boundless golden light in the dream, he suddenly understood something. His body suddenly became cold and began to tremble uneasily under the late spring sun. But that is not my original belief. He stared at the Taoist in indigo on the boat in the distance. His trembling voice was like the wind on the mast. It came out from his lips and teeth stiffly and coldly, with endless despair. The Taoist in indigo did not turn around. He still looked at the red morning sun with his hands behind his back. "Can belief satisfy you?" Long Qing replied, "It used to be." The Taoist in indigo was silent. Long Qing lowered his head and looked at the struggling shrimp at his feet. He asked painfully, "Is this really okay?" The Taoist in indigo said, "Yes." Long Qing asked with some confusion, "Is it worth it?" The Taoist in indigo said, "It depends on whether you are satisfied or not. If you are satisfied with the present, it is not worth it. If you are not satisfied, it is worth it. I have always thought that there is no real satisfaction in the world, so I think it is worth it no matter when." In the end, it came back to the original problem of satisfaction. Long Qing forcibly suppressed his confusion, shock, and helplessness. He frowned and thought hard. In a long silence, he recalled the past and guessed his future life. Was he really satisfied? In capital Cheng, he led the beggars to fight for food and territory. He stole money by kidnapping and cheating. Finally, he earned a sum of money and went to the kingdom of Song to open a shop and sell salted fish to earn money. Just like that, he lived a peaceful and happy life and became an ordinary successful businessman. He married a beautiful and gentle wife, had 2 concubines and had many children. Many years later, when he was old and made sure that no one in Yen Kingdom was after him, he secretly took his family back to capital Cheng. He knelt on the royal road outside the palace and pointed at the equally old emperor. He trembled and told his grandson that Grandpa had a good relationship with the emperor, but he should have been sitting there. Then he was about to die. He asked his family to carry him to the West Hill Divine Kingdom. He came to the foot of the holy mountain full of peach blossoms and squeezed into the crowd of sick women who came to pray to heaven for medical help. Then, he weakly lay on the stretcher and watched the indifferent and proud cavalrymen of Divine Hall and the black-robed deacons pass by. He looked at the majestic Taoist temples on the high ground. 2 lines of tears flowed down his wrinkled cheeks and he cried weakly, "I should have been sitting there. That kind of life was right. For that kind of life it was worth doing anything, even if he had to betray his original belief and accept the most painful spiritual baptism." Long Qing stood in the morning light by the sea and stood in the smell of salted fish and sea breeze. He was unconscious and didn't smell the stench. He was like a soulless body. Suddenly he knelt down. With a crisp sound, his knees crushed the struggling shrimp in the mucus in front of him. He looked at the boat hundreds of feet away, and the body of the Taoist in indigo. He put his hands on the ground and knelt down. Tears flowed down his face silently. He trembled and said, "Please guide my way." The voice of the Taoist in indigo sounded in his mind again. "Follow me." Long Qing, who was kneeling on the ground, was a little confused. He didn't know how to approach the boat, nor how to follow the back of the Taoist in indigo on the boat. When he raised his head, he found that he was no longer in front of the fishing port, but a vast blue sea. Seabirds fell into the sea from time to time, disturbing the morning light and the color of the sea. The back of the Taoist in indigo was only 2 steps away from him. He didn't know when he had come to the boat. Long Qing looked at the Taoist in indigo standing at the bow of the boat and was shocked speechless. When he saw the picture on the side of the boat, he couldn't help but narrow his eyes. The South Sea was much calmer than the East Sea, but the wind and waves were still very strong. Ships that could sail in the South Sea, no matter their size, were very particular. Before the construction of the ship, the wood used for the ship had to be piled up in the shipyard for a long time, exposed to the wind, rain, and sun. Only after the stress was relieved could it be used. In other words, any ship wood was dead wood. However, at this time, a peach blossom grew on the side of the boat. A new peach blossom grew from the dead wood. It was a black peach blossom, slightly trembling in the sea breeze and threatening in the morning light. "I have something to report to you. In the past 2 days I really have emotional problems and I really can't write. That's all I have to take responsibility for. I will change it as soon as possible and will never miserably step into the same mistakes as last month. Fortunately, I can have a day off tomorrow. I will deal with the details and emotions, and then I must put pressure on myself. I will have 3 chapters on Sunday and 3 chapters on Monday. If I feel right, then I hope that the 3 chapters can last for 2 more days. I bow to you. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 4:14. Looking at the clansman's formation, the woman knew that what she was most afraid of had finally happened. Looking at the mud on her body and smelling the stench, she thought about what might happen. Fear and grievance intertwined in her heart, and tears flowed down uncontrollably. She looked at the chief and asked in a trembling voice, "What happened?" The strong man looked at her angrily and growled, "You put a man from another place in the house, and you dare to ask us what happened? You unfaithful be***, you're a disgrace to the whole clan." The woman lowered her head in silence, panicked and didn't know what to say. Although she wanted to explain that nothing had happened between her and the man from another place, she knew that the clansman wouldn't believe her. More importantly, she knew very well that she was indeed unfaithful, and wanted something to happen between her and the man from another place. The chief coughed lightly and stopped the villagers from smashing the house. He walked to the woman, looked at her slightly lowered head, and glanced at her plump breasts. He sighed and said, "Lindsay, although you are from Uelluan, can we not treat you well after you married into our village?" The woman lowered her head and begged with a trembling voice, "Thank you for taking care of me all these years, fourth elder master and the clansman." The chief's face suddenly turned cold. He said, "After Brother Chung died, I made the decision to let you remarry. You refused and said that you wanted to keep your chastity for Brother Chung. So we did as you said. But what are you doing now?" Hearing this, the woman raised her head and looked at the strong man. She thought sadly, "Chief, you want me to remarry your son? How can this be?" When Brother Chung fell off the cliff and died while picking herbs, he was by his side. Who knew what had happened at that time? At this moment Xiao Xiaoshu walked out of the house. The villagers saw that the man from another place didn't run away, and even dared to appear in front of them. They became even angrier and brandished their hoes, ready to beat him to death. However, the clan elder strangely stopped the crowd. Xiao Xiaoshu had been listening for a while in the house. Looking at the situation, he knew what had happened. When he was in Chang'an, he knew that the people of the Great River Nation were conservative and traditional, especially women in rural villages and towns, had an extremely low status. However, he didn't expect that such a storm would arise. He walked in front of the clan leader and gave a few sincere words of explanation. The clan leader expressionlessly shook his head and said, "This matter concerns the reputation of our clan. How can we let such a shameless woman go so easily?" Xiao Xiaoshu said calmly, "If I really had an affair with her, would the clan leader punish me?" The chief looked at him and said after a moment of silence, "I know you are a Tang, so as long as you apologize and leave a sum of money as compensation, you can leave." Xiao Xiaoshu glanced at the trembling woman and asked, "What are you going to do with her?" Before the chief could say anything, the strong man fiercely said, "Drown him in the pig cage." The words pig cage seemed to have a strange allure to these villagers. Immediately shouts rang out in the small courtyard. They all shouted that they wanted to drown the woman in the pig cage, and then strip her naked and beat her with a paddle. Xiao Xiaoshu looked around and saw the greedy and obscene looks in the men's eyes. He looked at their twisted faces because of excitement and said softly, "It seems that we can kill these people." The small courtyard under the big banyan tree suddenly became quiet. The clansmen seemed to think that they had heard something, but they could not believe what they had heard. The chief's face suddenly became gloomy. He looked at Xiao Xiaoshu and was about to say something. However, before he could speak, Xiao Xiaoshu turned to look at the woman and asked gently, "Do you think we should kill these people?" The woman's body was slightly stiff, and she came to her senses after a moment. She had been desperate, but now looking at Xiao Xiaoshu's gentle expression, she felt that hope was returning to her body. She looked at the hateful clansman, and her body suddenly trembled violently. She cried and said, "I am not from this village. I am from the forest of Uelluan Kingdom. I was sold here by human traffickers. My husband is dead. They want me to marry the chief's son. I don't want to marry, I don't want to marry." She had never said these words to outsiders because there were no outsiders in this remote village. No one believed her words, and even if they did, no one dared to sympathize with her. So she wanted to know the story of the outside world, and wanted to have a story with the outside world. At this moment she finally shouted these words because she wanted to live. "It's good that you killed them." Xiao Xiaoshu looked at the people in the yard and asked, "Who did you kill?" The woman pointed at the white-haired chief and the strong man, and said in a trembling voice, "This father and son deserve to die the most." Xiao Xiaoshu took 2 steps forward. The clansmen in the yard raised the hoes and iron forks in their hands, wanting to hit him. The fence was trampled by these people. Xiao Xiaoshu picked up a piece of bamboo. Then he waved it twice. The heads of the chief and the strong man flew up. The clansmen looked at this scene in a daze, and their faces suddenly turned pale. Someone shouted and everyone fled in all directions. No one cared about the 2 bodies on the fence. Murder! Go and report it to the government. Frightened and desperate cries rang out in the village, startling the fish in the pond and disturbing the birds in the banyan tree. It tore apart the peace and rules that had lasted for thousands of years. The headless bodies of the chief and his son were still lying in the simple and crude yard. The woman's face was pale, and her body was trembling slightly, but the luster in her eyes was brighter than it had been in the past 10 years. Qiao Shaoshu looked at her and asked, "Do you still miss this village and this yard?" The woman shook her head and murmured, "How could I?" Qiao Shaoshu said, "Then come with me." The woman looked at his eyes in surprise, and her eyes were full of surprise. She said nervously, "Okay." She was very nervous, so she didn't ask where he was going. She wanted to go with him. As long as she could leave this village, she was willing to go wherever he went. However, at this moment Qiao Shaoshu suddenly became silent. He frowned slightly, as if he was hesitating. Some words should not be said at this time. The woman's body was slightly stiff. After a moment of silence, she said bitterly, "Yes, I am a shameless and dissolute woman. How can you bring me home? You'd better give me some money, and I will live on my own. In the end, I will still ask you for money, but I don't care if you laugh at me." Qiao Shaoshu looked at her and said, "I will only give money to one kind of woman." The woman's face was pale, and she said miserably, "I see. Unfortunately, although I am a dissolute widow, and I want to give my body to you, I am not willing to earn money from you with my body." Qiao Shaoshu looked at her eyes quietly, and said gently, "You misunderstood me. I mean, I will only give money to my wife, but I don't know if you are willing to give it to me." The woman was stunned for a long time before she came to her senses. She rubbed her eyes, wanting to cry, but also feeling a little embarrassed. Qiao Shaoshu looked at her and smiled. He went into the house, packed his luggage, and then walked into the yard. Looking at the woman who was still in a daze, he said, "Let's go." The woman took the luggage from his hand. The two then left. Ning Ke had been thinking about three things. The first thing he wanted to know was why the Sadhu Daosher was able to find him in Chang, and with such accuracy. Was there someone behind the scenes who was behind this? Second, if the judicial department of the Divine Hall was involved in the sword Garrett's provocation of the Academy, and the theft of Qiao Shaoshu's sword, then where would the sword Garrett be if not Qiao Shaoshu? Third, how to reply to the West Hill Divine Palace's request to take Sang Sang away. The last two things were related to the West Hill Divine Palace. Thinking of Chang Lishua's attitude towards the judicial department, he felt that he should go to the Southern Gate Temple, at least to inquire about some things. The great divine priest of revelation was now in the Southern Gate Temple. To negotiate with such a bigwig, he must first of all, of course, unify the opinions of his side, so that they could work together. Girls must have some dreams in life. Look at the Tao addict, her dream is very simple. She wants to walk to the end of the long road of cultivation. Look at Situ Ilan. She wants to be the greatest female general in the history of the Tang Empire. Even Tang Xiaotang wants to be the most powerful woman in the world. Ning Ke stood behind Sang Sang and muttered. Sang Sang squatted by the well, concentrating on pickling the small yellow croaker. She did not want to talk to him, nor did she want to discuss this matter with him. Only with dreams can there be pursuits. Only with pursuits can life be fulfilling. A woman without dreams will eventually become a lifeless fish eyeball, a salted fish that cannot turn over a new leaf. Looking at her thin back, Ning Ke sighed and said, "Of course I don't want you to leave. But since you have the ability, it would be a pity to waste your time on daily necessities. I'm afraid that when you grow old, you will be afraid of your current choice." Sang Sang placed the salted fish in the bamboo basket, and washed her hands in the cool well water. She turned to look at him and said, "I've thought about it carefully. I still don't want to go to the West Hill." Ning Ke asked why. Sang Sang said seriously, "It's the same old problem. Who will cook for you after I leave?" Ning Ke said, "This is indeed a troublesome problem. It's easy to find a few more maids. The problem is that I can't sleep well without you." After a while, he shook his head and said with emotion, "But I can't let the West Hill Divine Palace lose the great divine priest of light just because there is no one to cook for me and I can't sleep well. This matter will be recorded in the history books. My body will definitely be dug up by the future generations." That night, the master and the servant had a very deep conversation about this matter. They talked until late at night before reaching a preliminary conclusion and falling asleep wearily. The next morning, Ningke and Sangsang washed up and had breakfast. When they were about to go to the Southern Gate Temple to visit the Great Divine Priest of Revelation, they suddenly heard the ritual music coming from the distance. The neutral and peaceful ritual music gradually approached Lin 47th Street from afar. Wherever the music reached, there was first a noisy discussion and then absolute silence. Ningke was a little surprised. He pushed open the door of the old brush pen shop and looked at the entrance of the alley. He saw fresh flower petals flying all over the sky, and the music was gentle. A divine sedan was slowly coming under the solemn guard of honor. The great divine priest of Revelation had arrived. Damn it, it only took me an hour to finish this chapter. I still like to write this kind of rural literature. Does it start from Ingxiu? I'll try to finish the third chapter before midnight. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Qidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 4:15. Hundreds of Yulin royal guards and divine hall guards of Tang guarded around the sacred chariot. They looked solemn and looked around vigilantly among the petals. There were no remnants of the devil's doctrine in Chang, and nor were there any fanatics. Wherever the great divine priest of Revelation went, it attracted countless people to watch. There were pious women and elders kneeling by the road, and the people standing also bowed respectfully, not daring to look at the old man behind the veil on the sacred sedan. The sacred chariot entered the Lin 47th Street and stopped in front of the old brush pen shop. People in the crowded street were talking about it and envied the owner of the shop. They sighed with emotion about the arrival of the great divine priest of Revelation, but they did not know that another great divine priest of West Hill had worked in the shop for a long time last year. The Yulin Royal Guard set up a cordon at the entrance of the alley and invited the crowd outside. The divine hall guards occupied several key places at the entrance of the old brush pen shop. The veil was lifted and the great divine priest of Revelation slowly walked down from the sacred chariot. Ningke and Sangsang stood at the entrance of the old brush pen shop to welcome him respectfully. Only the great divine priest of Revelation and Cheng Lishua walked into the old brush pen shop. Ningke respectfully invited the great divine priest to sit down and wanted to ask Sangsang to make tea. But he suddenly remembered that Cheng Lishua had said it was disrespectful to West Hill and Taoism, so he did it himself. 4 cups of tea were quietly placed on the table. The steam slowly dispersed. The great divine priest of Revelation looked like a very ordinary old man. The deep wrinkles on his face were like mountains and rivers. Only the gorgeous divine robe he wore showed his noble identity. Ningke had met many bigwigs, but it was the first time for him to negotiate with such a noble bigwig like the great divine priest of Revelation. He was a little nervous and did not know what to say. Sangsang was also a little nervous. Although Ningke had explained the inheritance rules of the great divine priest of light last night, she still could not understand why the divine hall still wanted to take her back since her teacher had betrayed the West Hill divine palace. The great divine priest of Revelation looked at them calmly and suddenly smiled. As his smile bloomed, the mountain-like wrinkles at the corners of his eyes deepened. His slightly sunken eyes suddenly calmed down. They were so quiet that no one knew how deep they were. They were like an old well in a dry mountain made of stones. Facing the gaze of the great divine priest of Revelation, Ningke suddenly felt that his clothes had disappeared. He felt naked and instinctively felt that he had been seen through. It wasn't his body that had been seen through, but the concealment he had deliberately placed on his soul had been seen through. Even the direction of his fate had been seen through, leaving him with nowhere to hide. Ningke suddenly became alert and said, "Ningke of the Academy greets the great divine priest." The great divine priest of Revelation said, "Forget it." Ningke sat down on the chair opposite the great divine priest. It was quiet in the old brush pen shop. Ningke understood that he was the owner and should speak first. However, he did not know how to do it. The steam from the teacup gradually dissipated, and a green tea leaf floated up from the bottom of the teacup. Ningke's throat was a little dry. He said in a slightly tight voice, "Can we think about it again?" Cheng Lishua, who was standing behind the great divine priest of Revelation, frowned and said unhappily, "Think about it again? Mr. 13, can you stop procrastinating?" The great divine priest of revelation raised his right hand and stopped Chung Lishua from continuing. He said, I have something to do in West Hill, so I have to go back. Before I go back, there must be a result. Ninkei did not pay attention to the great divine priest's words at all. He was thinking about something else. He laughed dryly and said, The great divine priest of revelation is leaving? Did you buy any local specialties? Chung Lishua's expression was very ugly. The great divine priest of revelation laughed and shook his head. The smile on his old face gradually faded, and the deep wrinkles gradually smoothed out. The great divine priest of revelation looked at Ninkei's eyes quietly and said, You know how important she is to the divine hall. Sang Sang looked down at the tip of her shoes outside her skirt and quietly moved 2 steps behind Ninkei, as if hoping that he could cover himself. However, he could not. The great divine priest of revelation looked at Sang Sang lovingly and said, Because she is the successor of light. Ninkei hesitated and said, Sang Sang is still very young. It doesn't sound right for her to be the great divine priest of West Hill and be on an equal footing with you. Chung Lishua glanced at the great divine priest of revelation and explained softly, The succession of the great divine priest is a long process. After returning to West Hill, younger sister Sang Sang must first study the scriptures and then go to the secular world to cultivate in seclusion. She must experience the joys and sorrows of the human world before she can inherit the great divine priest's position. The preparatory work before this is called political training. Then he continued to explain, It will take a long time for younger sister Sang Sang to ascend to the great divine priest of light, so the divine hall is anxious. It is best to enter the political training period as soon as possible. Ninkei suddenly asked, Is there a holiday? Chung Lishua was slightly startled. He thought that the divine hall was not an ordinary school. How could there be such an arrangement? However, before he could speak, the great divine priest of revelation smiled and said, Yes. Ninkei looked at the great divine priest of revelation and continued to ask, How long? The great divine priest of revelation said, As long as she can spend more than half of her time in the Peach Mountain of West Hill. Ninkei asked again, Can she go out of West Hill during the holiday? Yes. Can I go to West Hill to see her? Yes. If she becomes the great divine priest of light, can she really get married? The great divine priest of revelation looked at him with a faint smile and said, Yes. Chung Lishua looked at the great divine priest in surprise. The question and answer between Ninkei and the great divine priest of revelation came to an abrupt end. He said, Then I have no questions. The atmosphere in the old brush pen shop had just relaxed a little when Ninkei unexpectedly added, But it doesn't mean that she has no questions. Next, you need to convince her. Chung Lishua was furious and scolded in a low voice, How dare you be so rude to the great divine priest? Ninkei said, I am not flirting with the divine hall. If the great divine priest said no to any of the conditions, then I would not allow Sang Sang to go to West Hill. Now I allow her to go to West Hill, but it doesn't mean that I support her going there. It only means that I support any decision she makes. The great divine priest of revelation did not pay attention to the conversation between Ninkei and Chung Lishua at all. He just looked at Sang Sang quietly. Sang Sang lowered her head and said softly, I don't want to go now. The great divine priest of revelation looked at Ninkei quietly. Ninkei said, Last night I discussed with her for a long time. After all, she is only 15 years old and still a child. I really don't feel comfortable letting her leave me. How about going when she is an adult? The great divine priest of revelation smiled and said, Next year? Ninkei shook his head and said, 3 years later. The great divine priest of revelation said, According to the law of the Tang Empire, a girl can become an adult at 16. The law of the Tang Empire says that a girl can get married at 16. But it doesn't mean she is an adult. Ninkei said, In my opinion, only when she is 18 will she have enough life experience and wisdom to arrange her life. So I insist on going to West Hill after 3 years. 3 years. The great divine priest of revelation sighed softly and looked at Sang Sang behind Ning Quebec. With this glance, the wrinkles on his face deepened, as if a storm had fallen from the sky, washing the dry yellow mountains and rivers even more precipitous. His eyes also became deeper and calmer. and the old well hidden in the depths of the stone mountain became several feet deeper. Sang Sang nervously waited for the answer. Ning-Ke was even more nervous than her. The great divine priest of revelation looked at Sang Sang with a smile and said, 3 years later, see you in West Hill. After saying this very suddenly, the great divine priest of revelation stood up and walked out of the old brush pen shop. The great divine priest boarded the divine chariot and left under the lingering ritual music. The master and the servant in the old brush pen shop were left looking at each other. So simple? Ning-Ke did not understand why the great divine priest of revelation said the last sentence with such certainty. 3 years later, see you in West Hill. Was the great divine priest sure that Sang Sang would go to West Hill in 3 years? Cheng Lishua followed the great divine priest and left the old brush pen shop. He boarded the divine chariot and lifted the veil. He walked to the back of the great divine priest and knelt down. He whispered, I don't understand. Do I really go back to West Hill like this? Junior sister Sang Sang didn't even make a promise. Verbal promises never have any power. The great divine priest of revelation took out a white silk handkerchief from his sleeve and gently wiped the corners of his eyes. As the snow-like handkerchief fell, the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes bloomed like flowers. Chang Lishua lowered his head and said confusedly, but since we are here, why do we have to leave in such a hurry? The great divine priest of revelation looked at the snow-white silk handkerchief in his hand and said after a moment of silence, because the thing that is about to happen in the judicial department is more serious than I thought. Chang Lishua raised his head and said confusedly, but you said a few days ago that the event in the judicial department is not necessarily a bad thing for the divine hall. The revelation God is just following the order of heaven. Stopping it in advance is equivalent to going against heaven. The great divine priest of revelation said, returning to West Hill is not to stop it, but to ensure that after it happens, it can develop according to the existing track. Chang Lishua's eyes fell on the silk handkerchief in the great divine priest's hand. His body suddenly stiffened because he saw a few bloodstains on the snow-white silk handkerchief. Only then did he realize that the corner of the great divine priest's eyes were bleeding. I saw the light on the Peach Mountain 3 years later. So 3 years later, she will return to West Hill. The great divine priest of revelation continued to wipe the blood from the corner of his eyes calmly. Cheng Lishua was a little confused and asked blankly, what else did you see? You idiot. The light is our closest companion. I only took a look at her and I almost went blind. How could I see anything else? The great divine priest of revelation said with a smile. Then he folded the white silk handkerchief in his hand and continued to wipe the blood from his eyes. The white silk handkerchief was gradually dyed red by the blood that flowed from his eyes. The deep wrinkles at the corner of his eyes were also dyed red by the blood. Like a gorgeous peach blossom. It was more like a barren land soaked in blood. Before the West Hill Diplomatic Corps left Chang and Ning-Ke went to the Southern Gate Temple and learned from Chang Lishua that the judicial department was indeed behind the attack on the Sword Garret. He became more and more worried about Chao Xiaoshu's safety. When he was thinking about leaving Chang, and to look for him in the South Jin Kingdom, he suddenly received a letter from the Great River Kingdom. He had thought that it was from Shanshan, and he felt an indescribable sense of joy. Then he found that it was from Chao Xiaoshu. He was disappointed and then happy and then angry. He's alive and well. Why didn't he write a few letters in advance? I think he's really happy outside. He's so happy that he even forgot his own father. What an idiot. A middle-aged man in a bright yellow robe angrily waved his sleeves and scolded. I guess second brother Chao met a pretty widow who grinds tofu in a small mountain village. His legs turned to jelly and he couldn't bear to come back. Only an idiot would do something like that. Ning-Ke looked at the letter in his hand and sarcastically said, in the secluded hall deep in the Tang Imperial Palace, the curses of idiots could be heard from time to time. The Empress and the others looked at the angry expressions of the Emperor and Ning-Ke and could not help but laugh. People really need to put pressure on themselves. Today's writing was really smooth. Tomorrow there will be 3 more chapters. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 416. Speaking of idiots, there were two people in Chang and who liked to call others idiots. One was the Emperor of Tang, and the other was Ning Quebec. It was just that His Majesty had always scolded people as idiots regardless of the occasion and situation. Ning Ke, on the other hand, was used to calling others idiots in a mean tone when chatting with Sang Sang. He was petty from the inside out. That was why he was so excited to scold Cao Xiaoshu as an idiot with His Majesty in the Imperial Palace today. His spittle flew everywhere. The word idiot flew like rain in the quiet palace, causing the Empress and all the eunuchs and serving girls to be surprised and amused. They covered their mouths tightly to stop themselves from laughing. However, the scene was after all a bit awkward. The Empress signaled the female official beside her with her eyes and led the serving girls and eunuchs out of the palace quietly. After a long time, the Emperor and the minister in the palace finally vented their anger towards Cao Xiaoshu. They stopped panting, and the sound of the word idiot gradually faded away. The Emperor picked up a square handkerchief from beside the couch and wiped the sweat on his face. He looked at Ning Ke with satisfaction in his eyes. As a wise emperor, sometimes he was bound by the words, wise emperor, and could not be happy. Today he could find someone to curse with him, which made him feel very comforted and happy. What's wrong with your little handmaiden? The great divine priest of revelation didn't tell me about it before he left Chang, and how did you discuss it? The emperor tapped on the table and motioned for Ning Ke to drink tea. Ning Ke picked up the teacup but didn't drink it immediately. He answered, we'll talk about it in 3 years. If Sang Sang wants to go to West Hill, she can go. The emperor asked, tell me about your little handmaiden. How did she suddenly become the young lady of Zongjing's mansion? How did she suddenly become the great divine priest of light? Ning Ke took a sip of tea to moisten his throat. He carefully told the emperor about how he picked up Sang Sang from a pile of corpses by the roadside and what happened to her in the following years. The emperor was silent for a while and said with emotion, such a strange life experience is hard to describe. The relationship between you and her is rare in the world. You should cherish it. Ning Ke nodded. The emperor looked at him and asked, why didn't she follow you into the palace to see me today? Ning Ke said, she went to the princess's mansion to play. Her Highness has always been on good terms with her. Moreover, the little prince missed her after not seeing her for a few days. As the emperor listened to his explanation, his brows furrowed slightly in worry. Ning Ke understood where His Majesty's worries came from. After a moment of silence he said, Your Majesty, although these things are the affairs of the world, they are ultimately family affairs. After a moment of silence the emperor asked, what did the headmaster say? Ning Ke shook his head. The emperor sighed and said, that's true. With master's temperament, how could he care about such troublesome matters? The hall was silent. After an unknown amount of time, the emperor looked into Ning Ke's eyes and suddenly asked, I want to know, what exactly is the enmity between you and General Xiahou? Without thinking, Ning Ke shook his head and said, there was no hatred before I went to the wilderness. In other words, it will appear after we go to the wasteland. The emperor looked at him and said, that's why you killed a military counselor in Tuyang City. Ning Ke knew that His Majesty was referring to the death of Gu Shi. After thinking for a moment he said, I don't know what Your Majesty is referring to. Killing a military counselor without permission is a capital crime according to the law of the Tang Empire. The emperor stroked his beard and laughed. He said mockingly, even in front of me, you are not willing to show any evidence. You are probably the only cautious guy in the academy these years. Ning Ke replied with a bitter smile, some things can't be answered. The emperor said, then give me a reason. Ning Ke said, in the wilderness, General Xiahou's subordinates disguised as horse gang wanted to kill me, and the general himself was waiting to kill me in the north of Hulun Sea. These two things had long been known to the imperial court through two channels, the secret guards and the imperial center administration. However, the imperial court did not take any measures against Xiahou except for a reprimand. The emperor put the silk handkerchief on the table and said, you should be very clear that Mr. First dealt with it like that. It was my idea. You should also understand what I mean. I don't have any resentment. I'm just confused as to why those bigwigs in the imperial military refused to let me go. I don't understand where the military's hostility towards me comes from. Ningke said. First of all, General Xiahou wanted to kill me in the wilderness. I can understand that he was blinded by the temptation of the Ming hand scroll of the tomes of arcane. But what about General Su Shi? As an important minister of the empire, he tried to kill my little handmaiden, and now he seems to be very dissatisfied with me. I used to be a soldier of the Tang Empire, so I don't understand why he is so vigilant against me. His words were very clear. Whether it was out of consideration for the Empress's mood, the stability of the empire, or the West Hill Divine Palace's spying on them, as long as Xiahou was willing to retire and the academy had agreed, the emperor would definitely not punish General Xiahou severely. Ningke expressed that he could accept this decision, but he wanted to let the emperor know that he could not accept the pressure from the Tang Empire's military. He wanted an explanation. After a moment of silence, the emperor said, General Su Shi has never been defeated on the battlefield, but he can never raise his head in front of youngest uncle. It's natural for him to be hostile to the academy. As for why he is so vigilant against you, I really don't know. Maybe you should ask him himself. Ningke thought that even though he was now a student of the second floor of the academy, it was still a behavior that was asking for a beating to confront the top military man of the Tang Empire. The emperor did not let him stay in this mood for too long. He stood up from the side of the bed and raised his sword-like eyebrows. He looked at him and said in a clear voice, Have you brought that thing? Ningke raised his hand to touch the hard object in his arms and said, Yes. That's good. I'll take you to a place. The emperor flicked his sleeves and walked out of the hall. It was the end of spring, the most enchanting time in Chang'an. Walking in the imperial palace, one could see blooming spring flowers everywhere, green leaves gradually flourishing, quiet lakes without ripples, and pavilions occasionally standing alone. The emperor did not bring any attendants or bodyguards with him. He only brought Ningke out of the palace and walked to the depths of the imperial garden. Along the way, the eunuchs and palace maids they met all retreated to the side of the road in awe and silence. Then, they looked at the two figures that were getting further and further away with surprised and puzzled expressions on their faces. The people in the imperial palace were the smartest people. Of course, they knew that the young man in black beside the emperor was the legendary master Ning Quebec. But they did not understand where His Majesty was taking Ningke to, and why he did not leave any servants with him. There was a two-story wooden building in the depths of the imperial garden. It was painted in red and looked very exquisite. But compared to the towering palace in the distance, it still looked a little shabby. The emperor brought Ningke to the small wooden building and said, This is it. Outside the small building, the green trees were dense and the wildflowers were in full bloom. It was obvious that they had not been trimmed for a long time. Ningke looked at the grass growing between the stone bricks under his feet, and thought that perhaps very few people would come here. Then he raised his head and looked around. His eyes met the walls of the imperial palace and confirmed that this small wooden building was not only in the center of the imperial garden, but also in the center of the entire imperial palace. The emperor pushed open the door of the small wooden building and walked in. Ningke followed him in. After entering the small wooden building, His Majesty did not go up the stairs but walked downstairs. A dark passage extended to the depths of the wooden building. Ningke looked at the dark passage and could not help but raise his eyebrows. He thought that it was indeed the most important place of the Tang Empire. There was nothing new at all. There were things like luminous pearls in the hard stone walls of the passage, emitting a faint light. It did not make people feel afraid but made people feel at ease. Ningke followed His Majesty downstairs. Looking at the luminous pearls beside him, he thought that any one of them could probably buy the building of pines and cranes. Thinking of the shabby two-story wooden building above, he increasingly felt that the person who built this place was a man who was inwardly coquettish. As he was thinking about these trivial things, his pupils suddenly shrank and he looked up at the stone wall alertly. He saw several deep lines in front of several luminous pearls. Those lines contained an extremely neutral, peaceful, yet indifferent and extremely strong aura. It seemed that as long as it was emitted, it could crush everything in the passage into powder. Ningke clearly sensed this aura and gasped in shock. As a talisman cultivator, of course, he could understand that these lines were all Fu characters. These Fu characters were very powerful, but they seemed to be incomplete. Now these lines on the stone wall were just fragments of the original Fu lines. He looked at the lines on the stone wall and calculated the time of their existence. He was shocked and thought silently, what state did the predecessor who carved these Fu lines 1,000 years ago reach? He could actually maintain the power of Fu for such a long time. Could a divine talisman master like his master do it? The emperor noticed his expression and looked up at the stone wall above. After a moment of silence, he sighed with emotion. When my father took me here for the first time, I was as shocked as you. I could only vaguely feel the power of these Fu characters, but I did not want to come here often. What are the conditions to activate these Fu characters? Ning Ke was indeed the successor of Master Yen Sei. He raised the most critical question. Even if the person who carved the Fu characters 1,000 years ago was a divine talisman master, how could the divine talisman he made still maintain its power after his death? It should be known that not every nation master of Tang was a talisman master. Today Li Qingshan was not one. The emperor said, there are no conditions. Anyone who enters the passage will be killed by these Fu characters. Ning Ke asked confusedly, anyone? The emperor nodded and calmly repeated, anyone? Ning Ke could not help laughing and said, Your Majesty and I are not people? The emperor also laughed. After a moment, his smile gradually disappeared and he calmly said, I am the Emperor of Tang. I hold the national seal and have the imperial aura, so these Fu characters can't hurt me. Ning Ke asked, what about me? The emperor said, you are now the owner of these Fu characters. Today's state is not as good as yesterday's, but I have gradually recovered. I will try to finish the second chapter before 11:30. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 417. Hearing the emperor's words, Ning Ke's expression became a little complicated. He subconsciously raised his hand and touched the slightly hard thing in his arms through the Black Academy uniform. The dark passage under the small building was not long. It didn't take long for them to reach the deepest part, which was an empty underground hall. Ning Ke had enough mental preparation for what he would see today, but he didn't expect that there was nothing in this hall. The ground in the hall spread around until it disappeared in the darkness. It seemed to be boundless, and there was nothing but dust. There were no countless treasures, armors, magic weapons, iron men or strange beasts, or traces of tactical arrays as he had imagined. The ground was so clean and empty that it made his heart palpitate. There was no gap on the ground paved with granite, and no one knew what craftsmanship the craftsman had used to build the palace. Ning Ke looked up at the starry night pearls on the top of the hall and the man-made stone walls, recalling the wisdom and action of the predecessors of the Tang Empire. He couldn't help but feel dazzled. The emperor led Ning Ke to walk on the clean stone ground into the hall. Their footsteps occasionally brought up a few wisps of thousand-year-old dust. The emperor stopped when they came to the center of the wide stone ground. Ning Ke noticed that there was a small hole in the center of the ground. The edge of the black hole was smooth and perfectly blended with the ground, and it was only as deep as an ordinary person's palm. The emperor said, you know what to do. Ning Ke looked at the small hole on the ground and suddenly asked, is this the array eye? The emperor said, no, the one in your arms is the array eye. Ning Ke was shocked and speechless. He had always thought that the array eye should be an eye, and the thing in his arms was only the key to open it. Now he knew that the array eye had been with him all the time, and he couldn't help feeling a little scared. After a moment of silence, he took out an object from his arms, put it at his feet, and slowly untied the cloth on it. The cloth was coarse cloth used by Sang Sang to cover the soles of her shoes, and it was very strong. Sang Sang had wrapped it in many layers, so it took Ning Ke a long time to untie the cloth. A pestle-like object was lying quietly on the coarse cloth. The material of this pestle was a little strange. It seemed to be metal or stone, faintly exuding a cold smell, but its surface was as warm as jade, and it was engraved with complicated patterns. For decades, this club-shaped object had been kept by Master Yen Sei. Before the battle with the great divine priest of light, Master Yensei gave it to Sangsang and asked her to pass it to Ning Quebec. So now it was in his hands. The emperor silently looked at the pestle-shaped thing on the ground. No one knew if he thought of Master Yensei, but his face showed a faint sadness and nostalgia. Ning Ke reached out to hold the pestle and felt the cool and warm touch in his palm. He was a little nervous and put his left hand on it. He took a deep breath and forced himself to calm down so that his hands were no longer trembling. Then he put the pestle upright and slowly inserted it into the hole. The pestle in his hand sank into the ground inch by inch. Ning Ke did not feel any resistance, but he could feel the smoothness of the ground. With a light click, the pestle touched the bottom of the cave, as if it was locked by some kind of spring. A small part of the pestle was still exposed on the ground. The complicated patterns engraved on it made it look like a flower carved out of the pestle. Ning Ke did not know what was going to happen next. He subconsciously stepped back and wanted to stay away from it. There was no vigilance on the emperor's face. He just quietly looked at the half of the pestle on the ground. Ning Ke stopped and stood beside the emperor. After a moment, the half of the pestle exposed on the ground suddenly lit up. More precisely, it should be the complicated patterns on the pestle that were difficult to understand lit up, like a flower bathing in the sun. The complicated patterns became brighter and brighter. The light spread to the lower part of the pestle. Even the granite ground was illuminated and the lines in the stone could be seen. The light in the lines on the pestle gradually condensed and seemed to become a kind of luminous liquid. It gradually flowed back and forth along the lines, which was very beautiful. A crack suddenly appeared on the granite ground next to the pestle. The crack spread extremely fast. In the blink of an eye, it passed through the soles of Ning Ke's feet, which scared him. Then he noticed that these cracks were not real cracks, but grooves formed by the regular subsidence of the ground. Numerous stone grooves appeared on the previously clean and empty ground. More and more stone grooves appeared, and they became denser and denser. Like an invisible carving knife, it drew countless straight lines on the smooth stone ground and cut the ground into countless parts. The liquid light on the pestle flowed down the complicated lines and into the stone groove next to it. Then, like a stream, it flowed along the stone groove and into the distance. However, there was absolutely no stream in the world that could flow as fast as the liquid light in the stone groove. In a flash, it had spread to the edge of the ground. No one knew how much light was contained in the pestle. It kept flowing to the ground, as if it was inexhaustible. After a moment, all the stone grooves were lit up. Looking at the magical scene in front of him, Ning Ke revealed a nervous and solemn expression. But his eyes became brighter and brighter. His gaze kept moving along with the flow of the liquid light in the stone groove. The stone groove at the edge of the ground was the deepest and contained the most liquid light. For extremely long straight lines surrounded the ground in the center of the hall, like a city. There was a deep, wide, and dazzling stone groove in the middle. It seemed to be a long street. "This is the Vermilion Bird Avenue?" Ning Ke looked at the stone groove and muttered to himself. His Majesty looked at his expression and smiled slightly. Suddenly, the calm liquid light in the stone groove violently rolled, as if there was a raging fire under the ground and the liquid light was about to boil. Ning Ke's expression became more and more solemn. A very faint sound rang in the underground hall, as if countless flowers were blooming, as if countless green trees were breathing, as if countless people were cheering. In reality, it was just the liquid light in the stone groove that had evaporated into gas. The evaporated gas filled the air in the hall, gently swaying like clouds. Then, unable to escape the gravitational pull of the stone groove, it slowly converged into lines or surfaces that glowed with light. These lines and surfaces that glowed with beautiful and pure light formed countless three-dimensional structures on the ground. They were countless glowing buildings that looked so illusory, yet so real at the same time. Ning Ke looked at the palace formed by light in front of him. He looked at the Yanming Mountain in the distance, which was almost at the waist height. He looked at the Wanyan Pagoda that was not even knee-high and looked at the thick and glossy city wall in the distance. He was so shocked that he could not speak for a long time. This was a miniature Chang'an city. But in this Chang'an city it was real and alive. The emperor walked outside. Ning Ke followed behind him. When his feet stepped on the southern gate temple that was condensed from light, his body was a little stiff. When he stepped on the houses in the west of the city, he was even more careful. He always felt that he had become a giant, and any random step would cause great harm. Fortunately, the lines and surfaces that were condensed from light and vapor did not seem to be connected to the real world. When they touched his body, there were no changes. Walking in the miniature Chang and city that was condensed by light, Ning-Ke felt very complicated and shocked. He saw many familiar buildings and sceneries. He even found Lin 47th Street and the old brush pen shop among the densely packed buildings. At this moment, the old brush pen shop was just a box. Following behind His Majesty, they finally walked out of this miniature Chang and city. For some reason, Ning-Ke felt much more relaxed. He held his chest and gasped. The emperor looked at the Chang and city in front of him and said, "The entire Chang and city is a big array." Ning-Ke had heard about this from Master Yen say, the first big array in the world, the God-stunning array. The emperor pointed at the pestle on the ground in the distance and the palace beside it. He said, "The center of this big array is deep in the building where we are standing now." Then he pointed at the widest, deepest and brightest stone trough and said, "The Vermilion Bird Avenue is the array route. The four walls of Chang and city are also array routes. The hole in the city is the door of life. There are countless divine talismans in this formation, and the Vermilion Bird is the most powerful one among them. When Wei Guangming hid in Chang'an, he avoided it. If he had dared to show his full power in the city, this formation would have killed him in an instant." Ning-Ke listened attentively in silence. The emperor pointed at the lake of light at the foot of Yanming Mountain in the south of the city and said, "This big array in Chang and city is not easy to build or maintain. Last year, the imperial court spent a lot of money to repair Yanming Lake. It has nothing to do with the people's lives. It is to maintain and repair this big array. These things have always been the responsibility of the Imperial Center Administration. The God-stunning array has a history of 1,000 years, but it has not been activated even once. However, every emperor of the Tang Empire has spared no effort to keep this big array intact. Do you know why?" The emperor looked at Ning-Ke and asked. Ning-Ke said, "Because this is the last shelter of the Tang Empire." "Shelter, that's a good word." The emperor said calmly, "With this big array, Chang and city will be safe. Chang and city will be safe. Even if the national power of the Tang Empire declines and falls apart, it will eventually rise again." Ning-Ke said, "My master once told me that when the time comes to activate the God-stunning array, it means that the Tang Empire is in the most dangerous moment. So this big array has never been activated." The emperor said, "But as long as it continues to exist in the world, whether it is activated or not, Chang'an and the Tang Empire are safe." After Ning-Ke successfully climbed the mountain and entered the second floor of the academy, he was invited to the palace. At that time, the emperor said that he would take him to see something in the future. Today he finally saw it. Master Yensei once took him to the tower and looked down at Chang'an City. He said that he would hand over the big array to him. Now that his master had passed away, it was finally his turn to take this responsibility. He looked at the Chang and city in front of him and thought about it. "There is one more chapter. I don't know when I can write it. I advise you not to stay up late. I will." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 418. Master Yensei once said that Chang'an was a big tactical array and also a big talisman, and the talisman was an article. Ning-Ke looked at the city in front of him, and his eyes fell on the relatively red ball of light somewhere in the south of the straight stone trough. He silently thought that it was probably the seal printed next to the article. The relatively red ball of light was the Vermilion Bird. As Ning-Ke's eyes fell on it, the edge of the ball of light slightly changed, as if it had sensed something. At this moment, Ning-Ke vaguely understood how to start the big tactical array of Chang, and it was so simple, so he was very vigilant. After leaving the shabby two-story wooden building, Ning-Ke followed the emperor through the imperial garden again, passing through the awe and confusion of those eunuchs and palace maids, and came to the imperial study. It was quiet in the imperial study. Ninkei held the array pestle wrapped in cloth, and felt a heavy feeling between his fingers. After a long silence he said, "I'm a little worried that I can't hold it." The emperor looked at him and said, "Master Yensei only has one disciple, and the headmaster of academy has agreed that you represent the academy to enter the human realm. So who else can hold it if not you?" Ninkei said, "Am I really going to be the nation master in the future?" Second brother and master agreed that I would only cultivate talismans with master, and not be counted as a member of the Southern Gate Temple. Who said that the nation master of Tang must be a Taoist from the Southern Gate Temple? Yes, in order to save some face for the West Hill Divine Palace, it has been handled this way for hundreds of years. But habit doesn't mean rigid rules. Moreover, you are the disciple of Master Yensei, and the West Hill Divine Palace can't find any problems with your identity. The emperor said, "From your tone, it seems that you don't want to be the nation master." Ninkei said, "When the West Hill Divine Palace wanted to take Sangsang back to be the great divine priest of light, I thought it was unreliable. Now that I want to be the nation master of Tang, I think it's even more unreliable." He said bitterly, "Now that I think about it, I'd rather stay in the old brush pen shop to sell calligraphy." Qingshan is very happy to be the nation master. Look at him, he doesn't want to die so soon. Whether you want to be the nation master or not is a matter for the future. You don't need to worry about it now. The emperor changed the topic and said, "Speaking of selling calligraphy, Ninkei, it's been a few days since your calligraphy has been sold. Come on, take advantage of today's visit to the palace to write a few more." Ninkei glanced at His Majesty and thought about how he was forced to leave behind many calligraphy sections every time he entered the palace. If Sangsang knew about this, she would be heartbroken. However, the Tang Emperor personally chose the brush, ground the ink, and waited on the side. In the face of such treatment, no calligrapher in the world would be able to refuse to write. He sighed helplessly in his heart and walked to the table. At this moment, someone knocked on the door of the imperial study. The empress slowly walked in with a plate of food in her hands. Ninkei bowed slightly and stepped aside. "Eat something first." The empress smiled and took the emperor's hand to the tea table. She handed a bowl of sour tea to him and then walked to Ninkei's side. She rolled up her sleeves and picked up an ink stick, saying, "Let me grind the ink." Ninkei thought to himself that he was not a bold and unrestrained person like Li Tai Bai. Although the empress was plump, she was not a romantic person like Yang Yuhuan. What was this? He refused repeatedly and dared not. The empress smiled warmly and jokingly said to him, "You dare when His Majesty grinds the ink for you, but you say you don't dare when I grind the ink for you. Could it be that in your eyes, I am much more terrifying than His Majesty?" The emperor, who was drinking the sour tea, laughed and pointed at Ning Quebec. He said, "She is the one grinding the ink for me when I write. Today I will let you enjoy this treatment." What kind of treatment was this? An emperor's treatment? Ninkei smiled bitterly and did not refuse anymore. He stood by the table and waited calmly, thinking of what the empress had said. He felt a little strange in his heart. In his opinion, the empress was much more terrifying than His Majesty. In the world shrouded by Haotian's divine light, the saintess of diabolism could actually become the empress of the Tang Empire, the strongest country in the world. No matter how he looked at it, it was strange and terrifying. Moreover, the empress was Xiaoho's sister. Ninkei looked at the empress's silhouette in silence. The emperor wanted to appreciate Ninkei's new work, so he stayed in the imperial study. The empress and Ninkei left the imperial study and came to the imperial garden. The empress stopped under a begonia tree and waved her hand to signal the palace maids to disperse. Then she looked back at Ning Quebec. Ninkei knew that His Majesty was looking for an excuse to let him and the empress be alone. Of course, it was not because of any absurd reason. It was because of the general in Tuyang City. However, he did not understand why the empress would come in person. Was she not worried that someone would see something? This was because he did not understand the relationship between the emperor and the empress. Or rather, he had never believed that the relationship between a commoner and a couple existed in the emperor's palace. The empress was beautiful, charming, gentle, and not timid. Standing under the begonia tree, her appearance was even more beautiful than the begonia flowers. Ning-Ke thought that she was indeed the saintess of diabolism. She was indeed beautiful. The Empress looked at him quietly and suddenly said, "Has His Majesty told you?" After a moment of silence, Ning-Ke replied, "What does Your Majesty mean?" The Empress said calmly, "About General Xiahou." Ning-Ke nodded. The Empress said, "Now you should know who I am." Ning-Ke shook his head, looking a little confused. The Empress smiled sweetly and said, "What a naughty child. I really don't understand why the headmaster of academy would accept you as a student." Ning-Ke smiled and said, "Many people have the same question." The smile on the Empress's face gradually faded. She looked at him calmly and proudly and said without any other emotions, "Xiahou is my brother. I used to be the saintess of diabolism." In Tuyang City, Ning-Ke had already known the biggest secret of the Tang Empire through the conversation between second brother and Xiahou. However, he did not expect that the Empress would admit it directly without any disguise. That was why he was still extremely shocked. The Empress looked at him and said, "I am very curious about the problem between you and Xiahou. Although he is violent and enjoys killing on the battlefield, he is definitely not an idiot like you and His Majesty like to call him. He should be very clear that killing a student of the headmaster of academy will not do him any good." After a moment of silence, Ning-Ke said, 2 years ago at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road in Min Mountain, General Xiahou's subordinates tried to kill Princess Liu. I was there at that time." The Empress gently plucked the begonia branch in front of her face and walked to the depths of the imperial garden with her hands behind her back. Ning-Ke followed behind her and looked at her with her hands behind her back. For some reason he felt some admiration for her. Walking to the side of the quiet lake and standing in front of the flowering tree, the Empress said after a moment of silence, "He did this behind my back. I even suspect that the Divine Hall did it in his name." She turned around and looked at Ning-Ke quietly. She said, "Now that you are also a cultivator, you should know that if it was me or General Xiahou who attacked with all their strength, you and Liu would definitely not have a chance to survive." Ning-Ke thought of the two powerhouses at the upper see-through state beside Xiahou and tacitly agreed. He said, "If this matter was done by the Divine Hall, Your Majesty will not be able to find any evidence, because those people are General Xiahou's men after all." The Empress smiled slightly and said, "I may not be able to convince Liu, but I think at least now you will have a different judgment on what happened at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road." Ning-Ke said, "In the wilderness, Lin Ling wanted to kill me." He knew that the Empress in front of him must know who Lin Ling was, and must also know about the horse gang attack. He did not need to explain too much. The Empress said, "I still do not think that the horse gang incident has anything to do with Xiahou." Ning-Ke said, "I agree with Your Majesty. I also think that Lin Ling did this behind General Xiahou's back. But General Xiahou expressed his tacit approval afterward, and tried to kill me again at the north of Hulan Sea." The Empress said, "Lin Ling would not do anything that would harm Xiahou's interests. So he would not try to kill you unless he knew that only one of you could survive." Ning-Ke shook his head after a moment of silence and said, "I was just an ordinary soldier in the city of Wei in the past. I have never even seen General Xiahou's face. Apart from these two things, it is impossible for there to be any hatred." The Empress looked at his eyes quietly and asked, "There really is no hatred?" Ning-Ke said, "Indeed." The Empress suddenly bowed slightly to him. Ning-Ke was inexplicably shocked. He hurriedly moved aside and said, "Your Majesty, what are you doing? The previous matter has been settled by Mr. First. If there is really no hatred that cannot be solved, Mr. 13, please give me some face and let him retire peacefully. How about that?" The Empress restrained herself in front of the flower tree and maintained a half-squatting posture. Walking on the crowded Vermilion Bird Avenue, Ning-Ke looked calm, but his heart was in turmoil. Whether it was the god-stunning array that His Majesty took him to see or the Empress bowing in front of the flower tree, it was a pressure that he could not bear now. Previously in the Imperial Garden, the Empress also mentioned Mistress Jian. Ning-Ke then remembered the rumors in Chang'an. The Empress and Aunt Jian were really as close as sisters. These things did not affect his mood. What really affected his mood was something else. Now the war in the northern wilderness had entered a stalemate. The Tang military did not seem to care about victory. There seemed to be some problems within the West Hill Divine Palace. They seemed to have the intention to temporarily stop the war and wait to see what would happen. This meant that Xia Ho would come back in autumn. Ning Ke had long known that Xia Ho came from the Desolate Man's tribe. At this time, he naturally understood why the northeast border military of the empire was so gentle in this war. Xia Ho might not be so gentle to other enemies. Now Ning Ke was not afraid of Xia Ho because he had the backing of the academy, but he did not know what to do when Xia Ho came back. His Majesty secretly instructed him in the palace, and Her Majesty personally pleaded in front of the flowering tree. It was not because they were afraid that a cultivator in the see-through realm could cause a big storm. They just did not want this matter to involve the academy, and did not want Xia Ho's retirement to have more twists and turns. The academy respected the law of the Tang Empire. The headmaster of the academy strictly forbade students from interfering in court affairs. Eldest brother had already allowed Xia Ho to retire. It seemed that Ning Ke's revenge had all been written until the end, except for the last method. Tomorrow there will be 3 more chapters. Brace up your courage and say it with a trembling voice. And then recommend the first place on the weekly list. Thank you. It's a new day. Please continue to vote for me. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 419. The method was taught to him by the headmaster of the academy with a stick on the balcony of the building of pines and cranes. Eldest brother also hinted at it in the wilderness. He also thought of the method when he was imprisoned in the cliff cave. The method was simple, clear, and full of power. However, from another perspective, it could be said to be stupid and not in line with Ning Ke's bright but dark outlook on life. Standing on the streets of Chang, and in late spring, Ning Ke thought about what would happen after autumn. He was sometimes excited and sometimes gloomy. He did not notice a cloud floating from the north. Are you Mr. 13? Ning Ke looked back and saw a man bowing to him respectfully. The man was dressed in ordinary civilian clothes, but it could not hide the stern aura of a soldier. Since last spring, he had become a celebrity in Chang'an. However, not many people had seen his face and could recognize him on the streets of Chang'an. Ning Ke was a little vigilant, especially because of the identity of the man. The man admitted his identity in the next sentence. General Su Shi requests your presence. The Tang Empire dominated the world with iron armor and swept the world with force. Naturally, they valued and respected soldiers, especially the 4 generals. The Defender General of the state, Su Shi, had fought for decades and gained many military achievements. He had opened up countless territories for the empire. Even Xia Ho, who had been very famous in the past decade, could only look up to him. He was the most powerful person in the military of the empire in terms of military achievements and reputation. Ning Ke knew that the most powerful general did not have a good impression of him. He did not know the specific reason, but he knew that he would meet him sooner or later. However, he did not expect it to be today. He did not expect that he would be tracked by the Tang Empire the moment he left the palace. General Su Shi did not choose to meet Ning Ke at the military ministry. Instead, he chose to meet Ning Ke in the general's mansion near the Vermilion Bird Avenue. It seemed that this was a private conversation. Following the man into the imposing general's mansion, Ning Ke frowned slightly. He was stimulated by the killing aura emitted by the poplars and stones in the mansion. Walking into the depths of the general's mansion, he saw the old general sitting by a desk on a quiet platform. The old general wasn't wearing court robes, official robes, or armor. Instead, he was wearing very ordinary cloth clothes. He wasn't planting cabbages or sharpening knives. Instead, he was holding a rice bowl and eating. The dishes on the table were very simple. 2 bowls of brown rice, a bowl of pork belly, and 3 pieces of boiled vegetables. The man who led Ning Ke into the mansion left quietly. Ning Ke stood outside the stage. After a moment of silence, he walked up the stairs and bowed slightly in front of the old general. The old general said, "Sit." Ning Ke lifted the front lapel of his academy uniform and sat down. He looked across. The old general said, I didn't expect you to come so soon. Let me finish my meal first. Mr. 13, please don't blame me for being rude. Ninkei bowed his head and said, General, your words make me afraid. The old general did not say anything more and continued to concentrate on eating. The old general's hair was white and his dark cheeks were full of wrinkles. He was a little hunched and wore ordinary cloth clothes. He looked like an idle old man that could be seen everywhere in Chang'an. However, when he picked up the chopsticks to pick up the meat, it was as if he was holding a spear and stabbing it into the chest of the enemy general. It was very domineering. Although the general was old, he was not an old general. A general was a general, especially when facing the enemy. The streaky pork gravy mixed with the brown rice smelled a bit fragrant, but the taste was presumably only average. The general, however, enjoyed it very much. His grizzled beard trembled from time to time, and the 3 pieces of boiled vegetables made crunching sounds as he chewed on them. It was as if those legendary demons from the underworld were gnawing on human bones. Perhaps it was a habit formed during his military career. The general ate very quickly. He swept away all the food on the table like a gust of wind. Then he picked up the teacup and rinsed his mouth. Ninkei said, Eating too quickly and drinking tea in a hurry is not good for your health. The general looked at him quietly and said, You don't have to pretend in front of me. Ninkei fell silent and stopped pretending to be a junior. He pretended to be gentle and considerate. The general said, Cultivators should come out of the human realm, not enter it. Ninkei did not expect that the conversation would enter the most critical stage without any foreshadowing or preamble. He could not help but be caught unprepared. He had originally thought that this would be a long conversation. He had thought that this conversation would be like boiling chicken soup, and that they would need to test each other's fire control. He did not expect that it would be so fierce and quick. If he was not careful, the vegetables in the pot would become burnt and could no longer be eaten. Why not enter the human realm? Ninkei asked after a moment of silence. The general looked into his eyes and said indifferently, Because for cultivators, the human world is too weak. They are like ants. It is easy for cultivators to become arrogant when they enter the human realm. Ninkei raised his head and looked back at the general's calm and oppressive eyes. He said, General, you have fought for the Tang Empire and have been in the human world for decades. Before being a cultivator, I am first a soldier. The general said indifferently, That is the biggest difference. Ninkei said, I am also a soldier. The general shook his head slowly and said, You used to be a soldier and an excellent one. But unfortunately, you were not a cultivator when you were a soldier. What's the difference? Ninkei asked. The general squinted and looked at him. He said in a low voice, If you could cultivate in the city of Wei, I would have trained you well and made you a great martial cultivator. Then you would have been able to truly understand what is going on the battlefield. Then the stories later would not have happened. Ninkei said after a moment of silence, I don't understand what you mean. I have seen all your files. The general's voice was emotionless and calm. You are indeed a good soldier. But you have not experienced a real battle with cultivators. Ninkei fell silent again. He had joined the army in the city of Wei when he was very young. But the Tang Empire was so powerful that even the cavalry of the Golden Palace on the grassland did not dare to provoke them. He had not experienced a real battle. He had not seen the performance of cultivators on the battlefield during his years of military service in the frontier fortress. The general said, People think that cultivators are very powerful. But they do not know that on the real battlefield, cultivators are also very weak when facing the surging cavalry. Ninkei thought of a powerhouse like Second Brother and could not agree with this statement. The general seemed to know what he was thinking and said coldly, Even a powerhouse in the knowing destiny state can only die when facing the sky full of arrows and the charge of thousands of heavy cavalry. This has been proven countless times in the history of war. Do you know why? Ninkei shook his head. The general said, Because the cultivator's body is too weak. Unless he can cross the threshold and break through the 5 states and enter the limitless state, he can ignore the rain of arrows. Or he can enter the Tianqi state and understand the supreme power given by Haotian. He can ignore any impact. Otherwise, a cultivator alone will never be a match for an army. What about powerhouses at the peak of martial arts like the General or General Xiahou? Ning Ke asked. General Sushur said, martial arts cultivators use their psyche power to summon the qi of heaven and earth to train their physical strength. They use their psyche power to condense the qi of heaven and earth on the surface of their bodies. However, as long as one is human, his sense of perception will be limited. His psyche power will eventually run out. If one person cannot kill him, then 100 people cannot. I will use 10,000 people to kill him. Remember, if a powerhouse at the peak of martial arts is invincible, why does the empire need to keep so many cavalry? Ning Ke placed his right hand on the table and looked into the general's deep eyes. He said, one cultivator can exchange for 10,000 ordinary soldiers. Isn't that powerful? The general looked at him expressionlessly and said, there is not even one cultivator among 10,000 ordinary people. There are not many cultivators in the world who can fight against 10,000 people. Exchanging 10,000 ordinary soldiers for the death of a cultivator like this is a very worthwhile thing to do in war. Ning Ke was silent for the third time. He turned to look at the upright poplar trees in the garden and the stones piled randomly. He had to admit that the first person in the empire's military was right and incisive. He could not refute it. He knew very well what General Sushur wanted to talk to him, so he was not willing to be convinced. He frowned slightly and said, but you and General Xiahou are also cultivators. At this point, the conversation had returned to the beginning. The cultivation of martial arts is difficult and clumsy. Without decades of hard work, there is no effect at all. Most people give up halfway when they have some brute strength and muscles. They become the servants of sword masters and psyche masters. So for the cultivation sex, the cultivation of martial arts is almost useless. The general said, only in the army can a martial arts cultivator have the chance to grow through bloody battles. To cultivate to the peak, who knows how many people they have to kill and how many times they have to be injured? Ning Ke asked, what does this have to do with what you want to say? What I want to say is that all martial arts cultivators are in the army. Just like what I told you at the beginning, whether in the eyes of the world or in their own eyes, they are strictly disciplined soldiers first, then so-called cultivators. They do not carry umbrellas in summer, and do not wear fur coats in winter. They have less selfish desires. I understand. Ning Ke looked at the leftover juice of the boiled vegetables on the plate and said, but I don't understand what you are trying to tell me by saying this. The general looked at him expressionlessly and said, what I want to tell you is that you are very weak. No matter how fast your cultivation level has improved, in my eyes and in the eyes of the Tang military, you are still very weak. With a single order from me, the armored black cavalry can charge at you and kill you. You only have 13 arrows. How many times can you swing a saber like the one used against Lu Yiqing? So don't be arrogant. You must know how to respect the law of the Tang Empire. Ning Ke raised his head and looked at the general's old face. He said, I have always been law-abiding. The general said coldly as I said, I have checked all your files and information. Since it is not limited to the records in the city of Wei. I know how many horse gangs by the Shubi Lake died under your knife. I also know that 3 families of hunters in Min Mountain were burned to death by you. As I said, don't pretend in front of me. The general said coldly, killing the horse gangs and chopping firewood is fine because the law of the Tang Empire does not protect people outside the borders. But how are you going to explain what happened in Min Mountain? One of the families had a newborn baby who also died in the fire. How are you going to explain it? No matter how you hide in front of the headmaster of the academy and His Majesty, no matter what image you have in the eyes of the world, no matter how frivolous and funny you pretend to be after you come to Chang, and you can't change the fact that you are a shameless, cold-blooded, greedy and murderous villain. Ning Ke lowered his head again and said nothing. He did not expect that the Tang Empire could investigate someone so far in the past. At this moment, he felt that his clothes had suddenly disappeared, as if he was naked. This feeling was not shame or guilt, but vigilance and uneasiness. He had never thought of himself as a good person, and he had never wanted to be one. In order to survive, in order to let Sang Sang live, he would do anything. Killing and arson were just ordinary things. The evil deeds that the general exposed were just an inconspicuous part of the bloody past. How could a person like him be a good person? Sushir looked at him and said with disgust, Ninkei, you are not a good person. There was dead silence on the platform. Ninkei suddenly raised his head and looked at Sushir, who was sitting across the table. He asked with a smile, General, is there really a person as clean and guiltless as snow in the world? The general looked at him and said with a slight mockery, do you want to comfort yourself with the filth of others? Ninkei shook his head and said, General, you talked about how difficult it is to be a martial cultivator and the suffering of the Tang Empire soldiers. To me it is a little boring. Because you have not experienced my life, you do not know what I have suffered. Naturally, you cannot understand the choice I made in the past. He looked at the general and said with a smile, in the deep forest of the mountains, you were caught by a hunter. For some reason it could be because you stole a rabbit from his snare 10 days ago, or because the hunter was a damned rabbit to begin with, or because the hunter was a relative of the damned old hunter. In short, he wanted to kill you. What would you do? The general frowned slightly. Before the general said anything, Ninkei continued with a smile, don't forget, you were not even 10 years old at that time. You were weak and tired because of malnutrition. You had a 5 or 6-year-old girl with you. You were injured and had no weapon. You only had a fire starter hidden in your crotch. Then you were locked in the woodshed. I don't know what you would do, General. But I would definitely light the thatch and dry wood in the woodshed. I don't care if the hunter died or not. I don't care if there was a baby in the room. Even if there was a paralyzed old man in the room, I would still light the fire. Ninkei's smile was very gentle, and the expression in his eyes was very calm. The next chapter will be out before midnight. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 420. Sushir's eyes narrowed. He had fought all his life and seen blood and corpses. He had seen many horrible scenes. However, the gentle smile and calm expression on Ninkei's face seemed to be more soul-stirring than those scenes he had seen in the past. In an instant, he thought more highly of Ninkei and was more vigilant about how dangerous Ninkei was. The sympathy that occasionally flashed in his eyes disappeared without a trace. Ninkei continued, of course, the story of the hunter's family being burned to death has nothing to do with me. I just heard it from others. I'm just curious, under such circumstances, what would you choose? I still want to ask the previous question. Is there really a person as pure as a lotus in the world? General, have you ever killed prisoners of war on the battlefield? Is it against the law of the Tang Empire to kill prisoners of war? General, when your subordinates rode past the fortress, did they kill the women and children of the barbarians on the grassland? If so, is it against the law of the Tang Empire? Then he looked at the general's old face and asked, General, as an important minister of the Tang Empire, you should stand on the side of the Tang Empire. However, when the enemy's powerhouses entered the country, you not only did not guard against them, but also revealed my whereabouts to them. I would like to ask, even if this does not violate the law of the Tang Empire, does it violate your conscience? The repeated requests for guidance were like heavy punches that continuously pounded on the old general's heart. However, Sushir would not be shaken by Ninkei's words. He smiled slightly angrily and said, since you want to enter the human realm on behalf of the Academy, you have to accept the challenge of the world's powerhouses. Why don't you want to let them know your whereabouts? Are you afraid that you will lose face for the Tang Empire and the headmaster of the Academy? Before Ninkei could speak, the general suddenly stopped smiling and looked at him coldly. He said, even if it was pardonable that you acted coldly when you were young, what about after coming to Chang, and from the city of Wei? After coming to Chang'an? Ninkei slowly raised his eyebrows. Suddenly there was a wind in the garden. It was slightly cold and the sky was dim. It seemed that it was going to rain. Where were you when the censor Zhang Yiqi died in the 14th year of Tianqi era? Where were you when the old blacksmith in the east of the city died? Where were you when the tea master Yan Suqing died? The general looked at him and asked indifferently. Ninkei's expression did not change, but his body became stiff. If his previous questioning of the general was just a small trick, Then the general's 3 consecutive questions of "Where are you?" were really sharp and cold knives that could cut off a person's head. He finally understood why Su Shi was so wary of him, and even secretly investigated and suppressed him. He confirmed that many people, starting from Lin Ling to the current #1 person in the Tang military, had noticed the murders and even smelled the scent behind them. Today, in the general's mansion, the conversation between him and the general. He was a general. When the censor Zhang Yiqi died, you were in the House of Red Sleeves. When Chen Zixian died, you were in the east of the city. When Yin Suqing died, no one knew where you were. However, that day was the academy's examination. You had a bet with Xie Chengyun of the South Jin Kingdom, but for some reason you did not attend the examination and even took 2 days of sick leave. The general stared into his eyes and said slowly with endless pressure, "Don't think that you are really strong. Don't think that you can really hide from everyone in the world. And don't think that you can erase the past just because you have become the core disciple of the headmaster of the academy. I said that I know everything about you, so I will tell you everything. Not a single thing will be missing. Not a single thing would be missing. Not a single thing could be missing." This was the spirit of the #1 person in the Tang military. Ning Ke heard the general say something like this for the 3rd time today. He did not know how many times he fell into silence. There was also silence on the platform. The poplar trees in the garden were slightly trembling in the wind before the rain. The leaves that should have lived in the north whistled, as if they would fall to the ground at any time. No one knew how long it had been. The general said, "The headmaster of the academy once said that the law of the Tang Empire comes first. This is the highest creed not only for the academy, but also for the entire Tang Empire. I will investigate what happened in the past. If I find out that you have violated the law of the Tang Empire, interfered with the court affairs, or even plotted against us, I will punish you according to the law of the Tang Empire." Ning Ke suddenly reached out and stacked the dishes in front of him. Then he stood up, looked at the general and said, "The law of the Tang Empire emphasizes evidence. If you can get the evidence of these murder cases, I will wait for you in the Chong and local government." After saying this, he bowed to the general and left. After walking out of the general's mansion, it was not long before Ning Ke arrived at the familiar Vermilion Bird Avenue. He strolled on the flat bluestone road looking calm and composed. In the end, someone still guessed that he was related to those murder cases. This made him very nervous, but he was not shocked by the conversation in the general's mansion. Even if Su Shi could represent the entire Tang Empire to sweep the world, he could not accuse Ning Ke without evidence, let alone cause any harm to him. Because he was not a soldier in the city of Wei, nor was he a foreigner who had just arrived in Chang'an. He was now a student of the 2nd floor of the academy, and a great calligrapher who was close to His Majesty. If he wanted to harm him now, he must first convince His Majesty, and most importantly the headmaster of the academy. Ning Ke could not guess His Majesty's attitude, but he was very clear that the headmaster of the academy would not care how many people his student had killed, because the headmaster of the academy did not care about worldly affairs. However, some parts of the conversation in the general's mansion did have some emotional impact on him. Su Shi was right. From the time he escaped from Chang, and to the thousands of miles of starvation and entered the dangerous Min Mountain, Ning Ke was, in a way, a person who did all kinds of evil. The reason why he did all kinds of evil was because the world he lived in was full of evil. In order to survive in the evil world, he had to do all kinds of evil. Later, he came to the city of Wei and then to Chang'an. He came to the peaceful and happy world and found that there were still many good people in the world, so he began to try to be a good person in the general sense. Everyone wanted to be a good person. Ning Ke also wanted to be a good person. Therefore, he had been learning how to be a good person since the city of Wei all the way to Chang'an. This kind of learning could be said to be a kind of disguise, or even more like the formation of a second personality. This kind of personality was very unstable. Sometimes he was mean, sometimes he nagged, and sometimes he pretended to be shameless to win people's favor. It was a little fresh and a little cute, but the real temperament in his bones was actually still the moment when he held the blood-dripping hatchet in the woodshed of the official of council's mansion when he was 4 years old. If he faced external pressure, if he faced death again, That ruthless and cold temperament would burst out from the deepest part of his body without hesitation. It was the night when he climbed to the second floor. It was the same when he met the horse gang in the wilderness. It was the same when he shot Prince Longqing by the Daming Lake. It was always like this and sometimes not. This was Ning Quebec unconsciously. He walked to the front of the Vermilion Bird. At this moment, the spring rain that had been planned for a long time finally fell. Chapter 3. Try to finish before 2:30. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 421. The rain fell from the sky, and the pedestrians on the street took shelter. The tourists from other counties also reluctantly left. Only Ning Ke was left standing in front of the Vermilion Bird in silence. He opened the big black umbrella, and the raindrops fell on the tight surface of the umbrella, making a dull sound. He looked at the painting of the Vermilion Bird in front of the umbrella that was gradually drenched by the rain and thought of many things. There was no need to mention the past. Today in the palace the Empress bowed in shock, and in the general's mansion Su Shi was the general, which made him feel very troublesome. In particular, Su Shi's attitude made him very uncomfortable. This kind of discomfort was not anger but a feeling of loss. Because he used to be a soldier of the Tang Empire, just like his comrades in the city of Wei, he regarded the number one military man of the Tang Empire as his idol. When they were drinking and chatting, they would be in awe when the name of the Defender General of the state was mentioned. He remembered a certain saying about spiritual needs. He liked riding horses on the grassland with his comrades in the city of Wei and risking his life. He liked being respected and even feared by the people in Chang'an City. He liked his senior brothers and sisters at the back of the mountain of the academy. These were all wonderful spiritual needs. Therefore, he wanted to be a good person and be appreciated by a military official like Su Shi. He didn't want to be wary of him or even want to get rid of him. Unfortunately, things didn't always go as one wished. The spring rain was getting heavier and heavier. It was a mess just like Ning Ke's mood at the moment. The solemn and elegant Vermilion Bird was drenched by the rain. That pair of majestic eyes seemed to be endowed with some kind of life and suddenly became lively. Ordinary people were completely unable to sense the changes in the Vermilion Bird portrait. Ning Ke clearly felt it. He looked at the eyes of the Vermilion Bird and felt the aura gradually condensing in the stone lines on the ground. He was very clear about what had happened. 2 years ago, when he first entered Chang'an City and stood in front of the Vermilion Bird with Sang Sang, he was scared stiff by the ancient murderous intent emitted by the painting. Later, he knew that the Vermilion Bird was a Taoist divine talisman. It could automatically sense the enemies invading Chang'an City and could exert a power close to that of a powerhouse at the peak of knowing destiny state. The enemy sensed by the Vermilion Bird was, of course, the big black umbrella in Ning Ke's hand. With Ning Ke's current cultivation state, it was naturally impossible for him to resist the aura of the Vermilion Bird. However, he stood in the spring rain with an unusually calm expression. It was not because of the big black umbrella in his hand. It was because he had a pestle in his arms. Ning Ke put his left hand into his bosom and held the array pestle wrapped in cloth. Looking at the Vermilion Bird painting in front of the umbrella, he said, "Now is not the same as before. Do you think I will still be scared out of my wits or become a quail in winter? I'm your master now. What can you do to me?" The owner of the divine talisman of Suzaku could not be self-proclaimed. It was passed down to him by Master Yen Sei, and then confirmed by the Emperor of the Tang Empire and finally confirmed by the pestle. The Vermilion Bird painting in the rain sensed the familiar aura coming from under the black umbrella. A clear roar sounded in Ning Ke's sense of perception. It was sharp and high-pitched, mixed with some doubts, unwillingness, sadness, and indifference. The rain continued to wash it, and the ancient murderous aura in the Vermilion Bird painting gradually faded until it finally returned to silence, turning into an ordinary stone painting. Ning Ke knew that this meant that the Vermilion Bird had acknowledged his identity. The sorrow in the previous cry in the sea of consciousness was the Vermilion Bird's recollection of its master, Yen Sei. Ninkei stood in the rain, holding the handle of the big black umbrella in his right hand and the array pestle of the god-stunning array in his left hand. Feeling the two different sensations, he understood something. The vermilion bird recognized its master in the spring rain, which represented the big array of Chang'an. From then on, it represented the safety of the Tang Empire and became his responsibility. He liked this land, this country, this peaceful and happy life, and he liked the people who lived here. Therefore, he was willing to take this responsibility. He was willing to use anything except his life to maintain the peace of the Tang Empire. But this did not mean that he would lose his life. Holding the array pestle in his left hand was holding the future of the Tang Empire. Holding the black umbrella in his right hand was holding his life. He had to hold both hands, and he had to hold both hands tightly. If there was a conflict between the two, like the lingering spring rain, then what he needed to do was to cut the spring rain in front of him with a knife, like when he went to the old library, and smash all the conflicts and dissatisfaction, like when the headmaster hit him on the balcony of the building of pines and cranes. On that night on the balcony of the building of pines and cranes, he once had such a conversation with the headmaster. The person I want to kill is very powerful, has a high position, and has a background that even I find difficult to deal with. You don't look like a person without a high position. Because my teacher is very great, so of course I am also great. Now, even compared with the tycoon I want to kill, our identities and statuses are similar. Then why are you still worried? If you want to kill, just find an opportunity to do so. My teacher seems to be very willing to let us students be unreasonable. But in fact, he is very stubborn and very reasonable. He always says that the law of the Tang Empire is the first, and the law of the Tang Empire is the first. How can he be unreasonable? What does being unreasonable have to do with the law of the Tang Empire? Can't I kill people if I don't use crooked ways? At that time, Ninkei thought that the person he was talking to was an ordinary tycoon in Chang'an. Now that he thought that these words came from his teacher, they naturally took on a new meaning. Can't I kill people if I don't use crooked ways? Can't I kill Xiaohou if I don't use crooked ways? Ninkei smiled, put the big black umbrella back on his back, and rushed into the curtain of spring rain. He went to the house of Red Sleeves and met with Mistress Jian. He told her about his conversation with the Empress in the palace. Before he left, he took a detour to the bathhouse, where he had killed the censor Zhang Yiqi. Then he went to the small courtyard by the lake in South City. Walking through the green bamboo forest, he found that the small courtyard had changed owners after he killed Yen Suqing, the tea master. He went to the blacksmith workshop in East City, and walked to the door of the backyard, silently imagining the scene of the old Chan Zixin falling under his knife. I used to kill you for no reason. Now my identity and status are different. If I stop for the stability and prosperity in the future, won't it be a waste for you to die? The rain gradually lightened, and Ninkei was ready to go back to the old brush pen shop, but stopped at the entrance of Lin 47th Street. He turned to Chuanchi Road and entered a tea house. Su Shi had already guessed the connection between him and those murder cases. He might even have connected those murder cases to the massacre of the general's mansion. Even if he had not connected this matter yet, he would definitely start to protect some people that he wanted to kill. Besides General Xiaohou, there were still people alive on the oil paper list left by Darky. If Ninkei wanted to kill them, he had to race against time with the imperial court. Sitting on the second floor of the tea house, looking at the pitter-patter of rain outside the railing, he carefully thought about the steps and began to prepare after making sure that he would not cause too much trouble. He asked for a pen and paper from the shopkeeper, and after thinking for a while, he began to write a letter hastily, and then sealed it, ready to send the letter to the academy by carriage. At this moment he suddenly saw a familiar figure. That person also saw him and said in surprise, Ninkei, why are you here? Ninkei said mockingly, Chu Yuxian, you did not go to the academy again today. Be careful that your old master finds out, and he will directly cut off your money. Ninkei's current status was already very different from before, but Chu Yuxian was originally a generous and cheerful person, and had the usual mindset of the Tangs, not afraid of the rich and powerful. He came over happily and said, What's there to be afraid of? You can just write a section for me. Moreover, if you want to go to the House of Red Sleeves with your current reputation, do you still need me to invite you? Of course you should invite me. Chu Yoxian's eyes suddenly brightened, and he said, since you have nothing to do in the tea house, and you did not bring that little handmaiden with you, why don't we go to the House of Red Sleeves? Ningke shook his head and said, I have something to do today. Suddenly, he thought of something and handed over the letter on the table, and asked, I have a letter to send to the back of the mountain of the academy. Can I trouble you to go there? Chu Yuxian said bitterly, you know that I hate going to the academy the most. Ningke said, a section for writing. Zhongtang? Chu Yuxian said happily. Ningke laughed and scolded him, you wish. Chu Yuxian took the letter, and his eyes suddenly turned. Ningke obviously knew what he was thinking and said, don't think about stealing this letter to sell, or I will not write the section, and I will go to your house to make trouble. It is just calligraphy appreciation, how can you say you stole it? Even if you stole it, how can you bear to sell it? Of course I will bring it home for my cultured father to be happy. Chu Yuxian was not embarrassed when Ningke saw through his thoughts, and he said with a smile. Ningke said seriously, this letter is very important, don't dare to delay my business. Chu Yuxian said, then I will go now. Oh yes, there will be a gathering of classroom 3 in a few days. I forgot the reason, but Jin Wucai asked me to ask you if you want to go. If I have time I will go. Ningke did not say anything definite. Chu Yuxian turned around and walked out of the tea house, and suddenly thought of something and said, what are you going to do? Ningke said with a smile, I am going to kill someone, do you want to come and watch? Chu Yuxian felt bored, and he waved his hand and walked down the stairs. Ningke drank all the tea on the table, and stuck his head out of the window. He saw Chu Yuxian get on the horse carriage, and carefully calculated the time. He was not in a hurry to leave, and instead asked for a new pot of tea. He slowly drank it in the tea house. The spring rain was falling outside the tea house. The sky above Chang and city was covered with rain clouds, and the sun could not be seen. Only the gradually dimming light showed that dusk was coming. Ningke took out a piece of silver, put it on the table and left the tea house. Accompanied by the surprised and respectful farewell of the tea master, he walked towards the West City Gate. He did not joke with Chu Yuxian earlier. He was really going to kill someone. I am very happy to say that I can't take it anymore. There will definitely not be such a thing tomorrow. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 422. The dusk disappeared, and the drizzle came again. A middle-aged official with a thin face walked on the rainy street with an umbrella in his hand. Judging from the color of his official uniform, his rank was not low, but there were no attendants beside him. There was only a cold-looking general following him silently. The soldiers and lower-level officials at the West City Gate stood quietly under the eaves. Their eyes followed the footsteps of the two officials in the street. No one stepped forward, and no one showed a surprised expression. The middle-aged official was the city gate officer Huang Xing, who was responsible for the opening and closing of all the gates in Chang'an and the imperial city. The general following him was Yu Shuizhu, a deputy general of the city gate army. Huang Xing was known for his diligence and incorruptibility. Ever since he took over the position of the city gate officer, he would choose a city gate to patrol every morning and evening. Other than Yu Shuizhu, he did not bring any subordinate officials with him. He was light and unaccompanied, rain or shine, and there was not a day that he did not do this. The people at the city gates of Chang'an were already used to the scene in front of them. They could only leave after the two sirs finished patrolling. This had become an unwritten rule. According to the rules of the past years, the city gate officer Huang Xing patrolled the West City Gate today. After patrolling the West Gate, Huang Xing confirmed that there were no problems and nodded his head. General Yu Shuizhu turned his head to look at the nervous soldiers and officials under the eaves and waved his hand coldly. Everyone knew that today was finally over. With relaxed expressions, they dispersed and returned to their homes. Standing on the rainy street outside the government office of the West City Gate, Huang Xing tilted his umbrella and looked up at the drizzle. He felt his legs were a little tired and said bitterly, "I'm old after all." Yu Shuizhu said, "Your Excellency can still serve the imperial court for another 30 years. Huang Xing asked, "You've accompanied me to patrol the city gates every day and returned home at night every day. My sister-in-law has long been dissatisfied. You've really worked hard." Yu Shuizhu replied after a moment of silence, "My life is given by you, Your Excellency. Not to mention accompanying you to the 9 city gates of Chang, and it's natural even if I die." Today, these 2 famous honest officials in Chang and city used to be comrades in the military camp. Their fates had been changed by a tragedy and were now closely linked. If Huang Xing had not made up his mind to take Yu Shuizhu to princely Peiyan, he might have died along with that general. Even if he did not die, he would have been neglected by the imperial court. Without princely Peiyan's protection, he would not have had the hard work and honor of patrolling the gate of Chang'an. Unfortunately, they were still affected by that incident in the past. Although the 2 of them were diligent and incorruptible, they had reached the end of their official and military positions. It would be difficult for them to be promoted any further, but at least they had glory, splendor, and wealth. Huang Xing looked at the city of Chang, and in the drizzle. After a long silence, he suddenly said with emotion, "When we followed the general back to Chang'an, we seemed to have entered the west gate." Yu Shuizhu's expression turned solemn. Every day, when the 2 of them patrolled the city gates at dawn and dusk, they talked about the affairs of the manors and the interesting matters of the court. They also reminisced about their military careers, but they never mentioned that general. That was because the 2 of them did not want to remember the tragedy and the role they played in it. Maybe it was because of guilt or maybe it was because of fear. Yu Shuizhu did not understand why His Excellency would suddenly feel this way today. He said in a low voice, "According to the imperial court's rules, they should have entered the city from the east gate." Later, this incident was used as evidence. Huang Xing sighed and did not speak again. The rain was getting heavier in the twilight. The pedestrians had already returned home. The subordinate officials of the city gate department had probably returned to their warm manners. The soldiers on night duty were hiding at the city gate or in the duty room. The wet street was empty and quiet. Only the sound of the rain accompanied the 2 of them as they silently recalled the past. 2 carriages were waiting silently at the 2 ends of the rainy street. They were sent by their manors. The stewards in the mansion had long been used to the rule of the adults and did not come to urge them. At this moment, footsteps suddenly sounded on the rainy street. The footsteps were very soft and stable. If one listened carefully, they could almost hear the subtle sound of boots stepping on puddles. It was a young man dressed in black with a black umbrella on his back. Strangely, the young man did not hold an umbrella. He let the rain fall on him. His clothes had long been soaked and the rain slid down a few strands of hair hanging down from his forehead. Huang Xing looked at the young man in black who was walking towards them and slowly raised his eyebrows. He only felt that the drenched young man in black was a little strange. He did not sense any dangerous aura and he did not think that anything would happen. That was because they were in Chang and a city with good security. They were at the heavily guarded West City Gate. Regardless of whether they were daring female soldiers or powerful cultivators, they would all become humble and calm in the face of the Tang Empire's majesty and powerful military power. Indeed, nothing happened. When the young man walked past the 2, he noticed the official robes Huang Xing wore and the light armor Yu Shuizhu wore. He bowed and then walked out of the long street. Huang Xing noticed that when the black-clothed young man bowed, the expression on his face was not one of reverence, but of very complicated emotions. He smiled and said, "We find it strange that this young man is drenched in the rain. Presumably, he will also find it strange when he sees us, 2 officials standing in the rain silent." Yu Shuizhu said, "That makes sense. Then let's go back." Huang Xing suddenly felt that there seemed to be something in his hand. He looked down and saw that there was a piece of paper in his palm. He did not read what was written on the paper. Instead, he turned around and looked behind him. He saw that the young man in black had long disappeared from the street. Yu Shuizhu also noticed this. He suddenly raised his eyebrows and said in a low voice, This person is amazing to be able to quietly put a piece of paper in the hands of your excellency. Huang Xing was silent for a moment and opened the piece of paper in his palm. The piece of paper was slightly yellow. It seemed very ordinary but also very unusual. The writing on it was probably written with cinnabar mixed with some kind of material. It was dark red like blood. There were some lines drawn on the top of the yellowish piece of paper. Those lines combined looked like a word, but neither Huang Xing nor Yu Shuizhu could recognize what it was. They could recognize the words at the bottom of the piece of paper because they were normal words. I came from the general's mansion to take your lives. The expressions of the two changed dramatically. Their expressions were extremely gloomy as if the night was about to rain. Huang Xing's fingers holding the piece of paper trembled slightly. The words General's Mansion on the yellowish piece of paper evoked the deepest memories buried in their hearts. Those bloody memories had long been blurred. Today, Huang Xing suddenly sighed while looking at Chang and City in the rain. It reminded them of something. And then this piece of paper brought all those memories back. The two were very clear that the general on the piece of paper referred not to the Defender General of the State Su Shi or the Defender General of the military Xia Ho, but Xianwei General Lin Guangyun. Huang Xing sighed and said, "Just now I suddenly sighed. It was indeed a sign of something." Yu Shuizhu said solemnly, "I'll go to the prince's mansion." Huang Xing nodded. The two separated in the middle of the rainy street and walked to the horse carriage at the other end of the street with umbrellas in their hands. Their boots stepped on the puddles in the street, making splashing sounds. In the beginning, the rhythm of the sound was still very calm and steady. Then the footsteps on the rainy street became faster and more urgent. This proved that their true feelings at this time were not as relaxed as they seemed. Yu Shuizhu walked quickly with the umbrella in his hands. The expression on his face became colder and more serious. The fear in his heart was replaced by anger. He just wanted to quickly report to His Highness that there were indeed fish that had escaped the net. The footsteps suddenly became slightly messy. His left foot stepped into a puddle, and the splashing sound became longer and more dull. Because he could no longer lift his foot fell into the puddle. It was as if there was an invisible sharp thread on the street floor, cutting through the pants on his leg, cutting through his flesh, cutting through his bones, causing his feet to fall off. It wasn't a single invisible sharp thread, but countless invisible sharp threads. Yu Shuizhu's knee broke in the middle, and then his whole thigh. Then the light armor on his body was cut into countless pieces. He was cut into countless pieces of fresh meat. Like ripe fruits, they fell from the sky one after another and smashed into the rainwater, making pitter-patter sounds. Huang Xing held an oilpaper umbrella and rushed to the horse carriage at the end of the street in the rain. The oilpaper umbrella in his hand was very old, and his face was very pale. He did not want to die. Although his oilpaper umbrella was very old, and the whole Chang'an city thought that he was very clean. In fact, he had taken a lot of money over the years. He wanted to live and enjoy everything that the money brought. Although it was hard to patrol the city gate every day, he actually enjoyed the fearful looks of his subordinates and the admiring looks of the people. He wanted to live and continue to enjoy all of this. He thought that he was a scenery in Chang'an city, and he wanted to live for a long time. At this moment he heard splashing sounds behind him. The splashing sound of heavy pieces of meat falling into the puddles was different from the splashing sound of official boots stepping into the puddles. It was very clear in the sound of the falling rain. Huang Xing did not look back. He did not dare to look back. His hand holding the oilpaper umbrella began to tremble. Looking at the horse carriage not far away and the steward bowing respectfully by the side of the carriage, his pale face revealed a look of despair. The yellowish note in his hand had been soaked by the rain and sweat. Suddenly, a bright flame spurted out from his hand. Another wisp of flame spewed out from his official robe. Another wisp of flame shot out from the wrinkles on his face, which already showed that he was old. Countless flames spurted out from the deepest part of his body, instantly melting his hair, eyebrows, eyelashes, skin, fat, muscles and bones, burning everything. The long street in the rainy night was dark and wet. The man under the umbrella was burning. After a moment, the oilpaper umbrella fell from the sky and landed on the rainy street. Huang Xing, who was under the umbrella, had already turned into ashes without a sound. The umbrella slowly rolled in the puddles, its handle slightly scorched. In an alley not far away, Ning-Kei stood quietly in the rain. He did not know whether it was because of the violent emotional fluctuations or the cold spring rain, but his face was a little pale and he looked a little tired. 1 chapter today, 3 chapters tomorrow. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 423. The number of chapters in the first few chapters are all wrong. Damn it. I'm sorry. My fingers were caught by the table and the chair. I'm stupid. It hurts. Wushang continued to write. Try to finish the second chapter before midnight. In the alley in the rain, Ning-Kei looked at his soaked black academy uniform and opened the big black umbrella. It would not be too difficult to kill the two of them, but it would be difficult to kill them before the imperial court, especially the military, realized what was going on and killed them silently. Huang Xing, who turned into ashes under the oil paper umbrella, was killed by his fire talisman. Yu Shuizhu was killed by Jing Fu. The Jing Fu was the most powerful divine talisman of Master Yin Sei. Before going to the wilderness, Master Yin Sei had passed this talisman to Ning Quebec. But because the talisman was abstruse, Ning-Kei didn't really master the talisman's talisman until a few days ago when he broke out of the cliff cave. With the Great Spirit as the guide, the Jing Fu that Ning-Kei successfully cast was more like a simulation. Of course, it was not a divine talisman, and it was far from the magical power of Master Yin Sei's Jing Fu. But it was very easy to silently cut a person into pieces in this spring rain. In the night, Ning-Kei left the West City Gate with the umbrella. He went to the Imperial Palace first and found the deputy commander of the bodyguard, Su Chongshan. He handed over some things and then returned to Lin 47th Street. Sang Sang looked at him, who was wet all over, with a worried and confused expression on her face. Ning-Kei explained in a low voice and went to the backyard to take a cold shower. Then he began to eat. Ning-Kei sat at the table in front of the shop and looked at the funeral notes left by Sang Sang 2 years ago. He was silent for a long time and thought of Darky, who died opposite the shop. It was also in spring and it was also in the spring rain. Before Darky died, he left a list of those who had participated in the 2 tragedies. Now that Huang Xing and Yu Shuizhu were dead, the people on the list were all dead. But there were still 2 people who deserved to die. Zhu'er didn't write their names on the list because he and Ning-Kei both knew who they were. They didn't need to remember or forget. Prince Li Peiyan of the Tang Empire and the Defender General Xia Ho. Sang Sang walked behind him and asked, "Will there be any trouble?" Ning-Kei said, "Even if the old general can guess it, he can't do anything to me." Sang Sang was puzzled and asked, "Why are you in such a hurry?" In the past, when he killed Censor Zhangyiqi or Chan Zixian, Ning-Kei had to investigate for a long time. Only when he was sure that the imperial court did not notice the matter did he make a sound. Gate guard Huang Xing and Yu Shuizhu were important figures in the massacre of the general's mansion years ago. Ning-Kei had been investigating them for a long time, but it still felt a little rash for him to choose to take action today. Some people in the court have already guessed that I did it. Ning-Kei handed the note on the table to Sang Sang and motioned her to keep it. He said, "If I don't do it today, I may not have the chance to do it in the future." Sang Sang took the letter and said, "If you still want to go to the general's mansion tomorrow, I will go with you." Ning-Kei shook his head and said, "No, I have already sent a message to the academy. Someone will accompany me when the time comes." The next morning, before the stall of hot and sour sliced noodle soup was set up, several officials from the Tang military ministry had already come to the old brush pen shop and knocked on the door. Ning-Kei was already prepared. He pushed the door open and walked out. He looked at the official he met yesterday on Vermilion Bird Avenue and said, "General wants to talk to me again?" The official's expression was much colder than yesterday. He said simply, "Please come in." Yesterday, he was defeated by Su Shi in the general's mansion, and then he killed 2 people after leaving the general's mansion. This was like a hard slap in the face of the Tang military ministry. Ning Ke was absolutely not surprised that General Su Shi would summon him again today. However, he did not expect that the place to talk today was not the general's mansion, but the Tang military ministry. Several horse carriages left Lin 47th Street and went straight north along Vermilion Bird Avenue. After passing Jianshan Archway, there was a very quiet and sparse forest, and the horse carriages turned into the forest. Ning Ke lifted the curtain and looked out. He could vaguely see a large flat meadow behind the dense forest, which looked like the scenery beyond the Great Wall. He could not help but feel a little surprised. The Tang Empire was founded on martial arts and fought in the north and south. The military ministry governed the 4 major border armies, the prefectural armies, and the Yulin Royal Guards. It was the most authoritative department in the empire, and in the hearts of foreigners it was the most terrifying place in the world. This was the first time that Ning Ke came to the military ministry. He did not expect that there would be such a meadow and flat forest beside Vermilion Bird Avenue. It looked simple and plain, but in Chang'an, where land prices were rising day by day, it was in fact extremely luxurious. He also did not expect that the Tang military ministry did not have a strict atmosphere at all. There were no high walls, watchtowers, and quiet yamen, but only dozens of independent pavilions hidden in the green forest and meadow. The pavilions with black eaves and bright tiles were of different heights and seemed to be disorderly, but they were located in the grass forest in picturesque disorder. There were straight stone carriages connecting the pavilions, which looked quiet and elegant without losing the atmosphere. Several horse carriages sped on the stone road between the meadow and the dense forest at an extremely fast speed. The officials on the stone road heard the sound and all gave them strange and puzzled looks. The horse carriage stopped in front of the tallest wooden building in the depths of the green forest. Ning Ke walked out of the horse carriage and looked up. This wooden building had 3 floors and there was a pavilion on the top floor. It had the same black eaves and black tiles, but the style of the eaves was different from the other buildings in the military ministry. The eaves were slightly curved like knives, and the red beams were straight like iron spears. A strong and direct aura seeped out of the pavilion. In the pavilion on the 3rd floor, the old man in court attire was leaning on the railing and looking into the distance. He looked indifferent, and no one knew what he was thinking. Yesterday's conversation was in the general's mansion, and the old man was wearing ordinary household clothes. That conversation was a private one. Today, however, they were in the military ministry of the Tang Empire, and the old man was wearing court attire. This conversation was no longer a private one, but a very serious and even dangerous one. Ning Ke walked into the wooden building and walked past the officers and officials who were busy sorting out files and military intelligence. He walked up the stairs and gradually came to the pavilion on the top floor. Yesterday's rain had swept away the ostentatiousness of late spring, and the air in the pavilion was unusually fresh. A cold wind blew into the pavilion and brushed against his face, making him feel refreshed. General Su Shi's slightly cold voice sounded along with the slightly cold spring breeze. Do you know why there are pavilions without walls in the military ministry? Ning Ke walked slowly to the railing and stood behind the old man. He shook his head and said, I don't know. Su Shi turned around and looked at him. He said, because the mission of the Tang Empire soldiers is to defend against the enemy outside our borders. If the enemy breaks into Chang and besieges the military ministry, then we will all take a knife to our throats and commit suicide. What's the point of fighting? If that's the case, why does the military ministry need walls? As for this pavilion, it's to tell all the Tang Empire soldiers that they should have the bearing and vision to look at the world. Ning Ke said, so there's such a deep meaning. Su Shi looked into his eyes and said coldly, the Tang Empire is not afraid of external enemies, but internal strife. The strongest fortress must collapse from the inside. Ning Ke said, General, there's a deep meaning in your words. There's no deep meaning. What I said is very simple. Su Shi said coldly, the conversation with you yesterday was to warn you that the Tang Empire needs stability and can't have internal strife. You should focus on the overall situation and know how to respect the law. Ning Ke, you are a student of the 2nd floor of the academy. I think you should be able to understand what I'm saying. Ning Ke said, General's teachings yesterday deeply shocked me. When I returned to the old brush pen shop last night, I asked the handmaiden to take out the law of the Tang Empire and read it by candlelight. Sure enough, I learned a lot. Seeing that he was still as tired as yesterday, the anger in Su Shi's heart gradually accumulated, but the expression on his old face became calmer and calmer. He asked a question lightly. He asked, yesterday at dusk when Huang Xing and Yu Shuizhu died, where were you? Ning Ke frowned slightly as if he was recalling. After a moment he answered, I was shopping. Su Shi asked, yesterday at dusk it rained heavily. Which street were you shopping on? Ning Ke said, I like to be drenched in the rain. Su Shi asked, yesterday at the West City Gate, it was a talisman master who killed them. Ning Ke said, how daring. Su Shi looked at him and said expressionlessly, there are not many talisman masters in the world, especially the talisman masters in Chong and City. The Imperial Center Administration has records of them. Ning Ke looked at him and said with a smile, then we have to ask the Imperial Center Administration to investigate quickly. Although the number of talisman masters is small, I think there are more than one or two. It may be more troublesome to investigate. Su Shi said, you are also a talisman master. Ning Ke answered, I do know a lot of things. It is reported that when the murder happened last night, a young man in black with a black umbrella on his back appeared at the West City Gate. Su Shi quietly looked at the black uniform of the academy on him. Ning Ke said, I also carried a big black umbrella on my back. Speaking of which, it seems that I went to the West City Gate at that time. Unfortunately, there are many young people who like to wear black. Su Shi said, but a young talisman master in black with a black umbrella on his back. Who else in the world but you? Ning Ke looked at him and asked, General, are you suspecting that I killed those two officials? Su Shi said directly, yes, because you can't tell me where you were at that time. Ning Ke suddenly asked, General, are you interrogating a case? Su Shi said coldly, am I not qualified to do so? Ning Ke shook his head and said, if I were still a small soldier in the city of Wei, General would naturally be qualified to interrogate me. But after the preliminary examination of the academy, I have changed from military status to civilian status. Even if I am suspected, only the Chong and local government can interrogate me. General, you are indeed not qualified to do so. Su Shi looked at him expressionlessly and said, according to His Majesty's decree, the Imperial Center Administration and the Military Ministry are both in charge of the Imperial Center Administration. Now you are a visiting professor of the Imperial Center Administration. Why can't I interrogate you? Ning Ke took out the waist token of a visiting professor of the Imperial Center Administration from his belt and gently put it on the railing beside the pavilion. He said, last night I went to the bodyguard office to ask. The day before yesterday, His Majesty had agreed to my request to withdraw from the Imperial Center Administration. But I still keep this waist token with me for the time being. Now I don't want this waist token, so General can't interrogate me. Su Shi did not expect that Ning Ke would do this in advance. He frowned deeply and then gradually relaxed his brows. With a mocking and shameless expression, he said, you really dare not let me interrogate you. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 424. A mocking and disdainful expression appeared on the face of the prestigious military leader of the Tang Empire. This slightly frivolous expression did not make Ning Ke feel that he was more like an ordinary person. Instead, he felt a heavy pressure. He replied slowly, it's not that I don't dare to, but I don't want to. General, you said that the military ministry has a pavilion without walls. I agree with you. The Tang Empire dominates the world and will not collapse no matter what happens in the outside world. I'm just worried that the disaster will come from within the city walls. If you insist on interrogating me, I'm afraid that the military is trying to suppress the academy in the eyes of outsiders. He said, I know you don't mean that, but we can't send this wrong message to the enemies of the Tang Empire. So I don't want you to interrogate me, and you can't interrogate me either. Ning Ke, Ning Quebec. The expression on Su Shi's face disappeared. He looked at Ning Ke and said coldly, if you don't deny it and take responsibility, Maybe I can praise you as a man. Ninkei replied. It's not bad if I can be a good poet. Su Shi said. You're determined to challenge the military of the Tang Empire? What an arrogant madman. Do you really think you're qualified? Although I don't understand what you mean. Ninkei paused and said, I'm the core disciple of the headmaster of the academy. I represent the academy to enter the human realm and follow youngest uncle to travel the world. I really don't know what I'm not qualified to do. Su Shi stared at his eyes for a long time. Then he walked to the railing with his hands behind his back and looked down at Chang and city outside the grass forest. He said, You used to be a soldier, so you should know the duty of the Tang Empire soldiers. So don't think that I don't dare to kill you. As he said this, a strong and indifferent aura exuded from the slightly bent body of the general, completely isolating him from the world around him. The fresh forest wind flowing through the pavilion suddenly stopped without a sound. The green trees outside the railings also stopped swaying. The superfluous leaves that had been blown off by the wind also stopped rolling among the grass. From Ninkei's point of view, everything outside the attic's railing became motionless at this moment, like a landscape painting confined by a frame. He himself had become a part of the landscape painting. Only the old man by the railing, completely isolated from the landscape, was still free. The aura of heaven and earth in the pavilion had already been completely controlled by the old man by the railing. It was motionless and had lost all of its vitality. As long as he willed it, he could crush everything here. Looking at the back of the seemingly desolate and stooped old man who was actually extremely powerful and terrifying, Ninkei was speechless. He thought to himself that the old man was indeed the most powerful person in the Tang military. This level of cultivation had actually faintly surpassed the limits of the peak of the martial Tao. Ninkei was very clear that he had absolutely no way to fight against such a powerful state. As long as Su Shi moved his mind, the solidified qi of heaven and earth around him would instantly crush him into powder. Cold sweat gradually soaked the back of his clothes and the big black umbrella behind him. The expression on his face remained calm. In the landscape painting, only the old man by the railing was free. Fortunately, the old man seemed to want to hear what he had to say, so Ninkei's mouth was free. I entered the imperial city yesterday. Ninkei looked at the back of the old man by the railing and said, His Majesty took me to the small building. He knew that as the leader of the Tang military, Su Shi definitely knew what the small building in the imperial palace meant. As expected, the old man's court robe fluttered a little. He continued, Before going to the general's mansion yesterday, I first went to the Vermilion Bird Avenue. Before he finished speaking, Su Shi asked, The Vermilion Bird has recognized its master? Ninkei said yes. So you should know that I am now responsible for the safety of Chang and, if you really care about the Tang Empire and want to fulfill your duty as a Tang soldier, what you need to do now is to protect my safety, not to try to kill me. Su Shi stood by the railing and looked into the distance with his hands behind his back. After a long silence, he suddenly murmured with some regret and anger, I did not expect to fall into your hands in the end. Ninkei did not say anything. Su Shi turned around and looked at him expressionlessly. He said, The reason why I investigated you is that I did not agree with His Majesty to hand over the array I pestle to you. To tell you the truth, Yinsei and I have been friends for many years. But I think he has misjudged you, and so has the headmaster of academy. Ninkei did not expect the military leader of the Tang Empire to have such a deep friendship with his master. He could not understand what had happened recently. He slightly raised his eyebrows and asked why. Because you are not upright. Because you are heartless and cold-blooded. Because I am very clear that if the Tang Empire is really at a critical juncture, you will not live and die with this magnificent city. Su Shi looked at him and said word by word. Ninkei fell silent again. He had to admit that Su Shi was right about him. Yesterday in front of the Vermilion Bird painting, he had been full of heroic spirit and silently vowed to protect Chang and the Tang Empire. However, before he truly vowed in his heart, he still put his life in the most important position. After a long silence, he raised his head and looked at Su Shi seriously. He said, I can promise you that at least I will do my best. Sushur said, "How can I trust you?" Ninkei asked, "Why can't you trust me?" Sushur said, "Because you are not trustworthy." Ninkei asked back, "What kind of people are trustworthy?" Sushur said, "Like your master Yensei. He seems to be playful, but he actually knows what is justice and what is reverence." Ninkei shook his head and said, "My master is dead. Although you have been friends with him for decades, I don't think you know him well enough. My master has never been a person who upholds justice. He doesn't know reverence either. He only knows what is called responsibility. And I know that too." Sushur said, "Your hands are stained with too much blood. You are not qualified to hold that pestle." Ninkei said, "Yesterday in the general's mansion, you asked me where I was when Censor Zhongichi died in the 14th year of Tianqi era. Where was I when the old blacksmith in the east of the city died? Where was I when tea master Yen Suqing died? Today in this attic, you asked me where I was when Huang and you died last night." Sushur looked back at him coldly. Ninkei asked calmly, "You have asked me many questions about where I was. I also want to ask, where were you when Xiahou massacred the villages in the Yen territory and burned hundreds of innocent people? Where were you when Xiahou buried 30,000 surrendered soldiers? Where were you when the Xianwei general's mansion was flooded with blood?" As he listened to these questions, Sushur seemed to have aged a little in an instant. The atmosphere in the attic loosened a little, and the scenery outside the building came to life again. Ninkei took 2 steps forward and came to Sushur. He continued, "There is indeed a lot of blood on my hands. General, maybe there is no blood on your hands, but it doesn't mean that your hands are cleaner than mine. As you said, I am certainly not a good person. I never care about the ugly, bloody, and unfair things in the world as long as they have nothing to do with me. Maybe I am not qualified to hold that pestle, but there are not many people in the world who are qualified to question my right to hold that pestle. At least not you, General." Xiahou was able to stay out of it, and those generals and captains who massacred the villages were not punished. The imperial court said that there was no evidence and the case could not be investigated according to the law of the Tang Empire. In fact, you and I both know that it was only because Xiahou had made contributions to the Tang Empire and the northeast border military was useful to the empire. Ninkei said, "Since the imperial court insists that the law of the Tang Empire comes first, then if you want to investigate my relationship with those murders, please find evidence first. Otherwise, please don't bother me in the future." Sushur was silent for a long time. He looked at him and asked coldly, "Then can you tell me, did you do it for justice or for revenge?" "I am not a messenger of justice." Ninkei said, "There is no hatred between me and General Xiahou. It is only because he offended me in the wilderness." Sushur said, "Who can believe this?" Ninkei said, "I don't need others to believe me. As long as the headmaster and His Majesty have no objections." Sushur said, "Do you think His Majesty will always favor and trust you?" Ninkei shook his head and said, "This has nothing to do with favor and trust. But I think even if His Majesty knew about this, he would probably think that I did the right thing." He suddenly felt that he had said enough today. So he turned around and walked to the stairs. However, at this moment Sushur suddenly sighed. "You are very calm. I can imagine that you will become a very good person in the future, even better than Ku Haoran. Then you may also be more dangerous than him." Ninkei heard the voice behind him and stopped. He thought of what His Majesty had said in the palace. Sushur was undefeated on the battlefield, but he had suffered a great loss in the hands of youngest uncle. Did he really have to bear the consequences for his teacher? He turned around and looked at Sushur, who was standing by the railing. He was finally annoyed. "I respect you as the Defender General of the state. That's why I said so much to you with sincerity. If you really want to fall out with me and don't care about the law of the Tang Empire, then why did you say so much nonsense before? The law of the Tang Empire is not a fig leaf. It is the foundation of the Tang Empire. If you still think this way, then I can't let it continue like this." Sushur looked at him and said calmly, "As long as it doesn't violate the law of the Tang Empire, I have many ways to make you disappear." Ninkei said, "I am looking forward to it." Then he shook his head and said, "Don't lead some Buddhist and Taoist people to challenge me like the previous times. You should know that it is not very useful." Sushur said, Do you really think that no one dares to challenge you after Lu Yiqing lost to you? Ningke said, at least a big shot like you will not challenge me, because you can't afford to lose that face. At this moment, a voice sounded behind him. I can afford to lose that face. Ningke turned around and saw a slightly fat man at the entrance of the stairs. The man smiled and said, my name is Wang Jinglu. Ningke looked at Su Shi, who was standing by the railing, and shook his head. He said, it's a bit vulgar. My hand hurts and I am upset. The third chapter may be late. Please don't wait. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Qidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 425. Ningke was very satisfied with his performance in the pavilion. His words directly made Su Shi feel sad, and he was not in the mood to continue the interrogation. However, he did not expect such a situation to await him after his words. Looking at Wang Jinglu taking out the challenge certificate issued by the Imperial Center Administration, Ningke thought that this was really boring. As expected, they were going to fight again. It was really cliché. And if Su Shi was going to use the powerhouses in the military to directly beat him down, then with his prestige and status, why did he talk so much with him? Did Su Shi really expect to use words to move him to tears and make him deeply repent so that he would surrender to the military ministry and admit that he killed those people? This idea was also very cliché. However, no matter how cliché it was, Wang Jinglu was already standing in front of him with a very gentle expression and firm eyes. It was obvious that he wanted to fight. Ningke had never seen Wang Jinglu, but he had heard of him. Anyone who dared to call himself the first person below the knowing destiny state deserved to be vigilant. And he had heard a story from his master, Yen Sei. 2 years ago, on a rainy night in the Spring Breeze Pavilion, he killed people on the second hung street, and Wang Jinglu was waiting in the horse carriage in the middle of the street. They should have met, but they were separated by a divine Jing talisman. I have learned the Jing talisman. Ningke looked at Wang Jinglu and said happily, not like showing off but like announcing good news. Wang Jinglu was not happy and said with a sad expression, I was kicked by His Majesty to the general, and it was said that it was also Master Yen Sei's idea. I am very grateful to him. Why do you use him to humiliate me? Ningke said, I am telling the truth. I don't want to humiliate you. Since there is some fate between us, why do we have to fight? Wang Jinglu held the paper in his hand and sighed. This is the first challenge certificate issued by the Imperial Center Administration in 10 years. Do you think it's possible not to fight? Ningke looked at Su Shi and said sarcastically, it's okay to push outsiders to challenge me, but now you want the powerhouses in the military to fight me. Did you forget that we are all Tangs? Su Shi looked at the scenery outside the fence and said nothing. Since he broke through the cliff cave, Ningke's cultivation state had rapidly improved to the upper see-through state. Otherwise, he would not be able to use such a powerful knife. However, the upper see-through state was still below the knowing destiny state. Facing Wang Jinglu, who was known to be invincible below the knowing destiny state, he did not have the confidence to defeat him. I don't accept the challenge. Ningke said, although the Academy seems to have the obligation to accept challenges after entering the human realm, you are a soldier of the Tang Empire. If this matter is spread out, both you and I will lose face. Wang Jinglu said, as I said, I can afford to lose face, so I can afford to lose face. In terms of shamelessness, you are no match for me. Ningke looked at him and said. Then, he walked to the edge of the pavilion and looked at the meadow and forest opposite. He shouted, have you finished that thing? As soon as he finished speaking, a young man who was much fatter than Wang Jinglu walked out from the depths of the forest. He rubbed his hands and moved his feet even slower than a girl from a wealthy family. It was obvious that he did not want to enter the building. Ningke shouted at him, if you don't come, I will be beaten to death. The young fatty was furious. He raised his head and shouted upstairs, aren't you afraid that I'll be beaten to death? Ningke glanced at Su Shi, who was standing by the railing not far away, and said, some people are too proud of their status to kill a fat man like you. The sound of footsteps rang out. Chan Pippi climbed up the stairs panting and walked into the pavilion. He first bowed respectfully to Su Shi, who was standing by the railing, and then looked at Wang Jinglu and said, "You have to fight with me first." Wang Jinglu looked at Chan Pippi in front of him and thought of the finger attack he received in the Chang and local government on New Year's Day. His expression became more and more bitter, and he said helplessly, "Why is it you again?" Ning Ke explained, "In the whole second floor of the academy, I can only order him around." Wang Jinglu smiled bitterly and said, "He is invincible below the knowing destiny state. After all, he is below the knowing destiny state. I am no match for Mr. 12. But before that, I would like to ask Mr. 13 for advice." Chan Pippi shook his head and took out a thick stack of papers from his arms. He licked his chubby fingers and took out the top one and handed it to Wang Jinglu. "The challenge permission from the Imperial Center Administration. This permit was issued and stamped earlier than yours," Li Yao said. "I have 62 permits issued by the Imperial Center Administration, and each one is earlier than yours. So even if you want to fight with Ning Ke, you have to finish these 62 rounds with me first." Wang Jinglu was stunned. He took the stack of papers and looked through them. Even though he was not afraid of anything and was still not afraid when he was knocked down by Chan Pippi in the Chang and local government that day, he was finally afraid. Failure was not terrible. But what if he lost 62 rounds in a row? At this time, Chan Pippi did not use the natural stream magical finger with the no-boundary spirit of the academy. But Wang Jinglu felt that he had been hit by the natural stream magical finger 62 times, and he had the urge to vomit blood. Ning Ke looked at the old man by the railing and said, "I thought that you would not use such a vulgar method as a challenge to a duel. But in order to be safe, I still made some preparations in advance." According to the relevant provisions of the 4th chapter of the miscellaneous volume of the Law of the Tang Empire, any powerhouse in the army who wants to duel with me must first pass my 12th brother. If you don't want Wang Jinglu to vomit blood every day and eventually die as a scum, you'd better not try. Wang Jinglu's face became more and more gloomy. Chan Pippi walked to Su Shi and bowed respectfully again. He said, "Second brother asked me to bring you a message. The academy is strictly prohibited from interfering in the affairs of the imperial court, so the imperial court had better not interfere in the affairs of the academy." Su Shi had been silent since Chan Pippi appeared. As the number one person in the military of the Tang Empire, he naturally did not care about Chan Pippi. But he had to maintain a certain degree of respect for some people in the back of the mountain of the academy, such as that second brother. "Help me bring a message to Mr. Second," Su Shi said. "What if the people in the academy have already interfered in the affairs of the imperial court?" Chan Pippi was silent for a moment and then said, "Second brother guessed that you would have this problem. He said that even so, the academy should take care of it. Of course, if you can find evidence of the people in the back of the mountain of the academy interfering in the affairs of the imperial court, then he will report it to the headmaster of the academy and discuss it with the imperial court." Walking down the pavilion, they walked between the small buildings of the military ministry on the meadow and in the forest. Chan Pippi suddenly said, "General Su Shi is a good man." Ning Ke looked at a big tree in front of the stone road and said, "A hypocrite." Chan Pippi shook his head and said, "No." Ning Ke said, "He seems to be awe-inspiring and righteous, but in fact he has mixed up a lot of mud. If he is not a hypocrite, then what is?" Chan Pippi said, "The headmaster of the academy once said that if one has a good heart and only makes some concessions for the general trend, then one can only say that one has lost his sharpness, but cannot be called a hypocrite." Ning Ke kicked a piece of gravel that was crushed by the carriage wheel and said, "Even the most kind and righteous person in the world is a bad person if he does not treat me well." Chan Pippi thought for a moment and said, "It seems to make sense." Ning Ke suddenly sniffed and looked at him in confusion. He asked, "Why are you sweating so much?" The clothes on Chan Pippi's back were already wet with sweat. He explained, "Fat people are afraid of heat." Ning Ke shook his head and did not accept this explanation. Chan Pippi said with shame and annoyance, "Your sweat has dried into salt flowers, and you still have the nerve to say that to me." Ning Ke said slowly like the eldest brother, I am just in the see-through state, and I am involved, so it is normal for me to be afraid. Senior brother, you are a grand cultivator in the knowing destiny state. This is embarrassing. Chun Pippi suddenly stopped and looked at him seriously. He said, "Do you know what kind of person Su Shi is?" Ning Ke shook his head. Chun Pippi said, "He is one of the most powerful figures in the world. Previously in the attic, if he wanted to, he could kill people like you and me on the street with just a wave of his hand." Ning Ke thought, why didn't I feel it? The most terrifying thing is his identity as the Defender General of the state. He holds the military power of the Tang Empire in his hands, and has countless powerhouses under his command. He has tens of thousands of cavalry, and can sweep thousands of miles. Chun Pippi said, "You want me to fight with such a bigwig? Why should I not be afraid?" Ning Ke said sarcastically, "Then why should I not be afraid? Because you are an idiot." Chun Pippi reprimanded him bluntly. Even Lu Bai would be too afraid to eat or drink to fight with the entire Tang Empire's military, but you don't take it seriously. If you are not an idiot, then what are you? Ning Ke asked, "What about youngest uncle back then?" Chun Pippi said, "Youngest uncle faced the whole world back then. But what makes you think you can compete with youngest uncle?" Ning Ke said, "Of course I am not as good as youngest uncle, but I am more shameless than him." Chun Pippi corrected him. "You are more shameless." Ning Ke didn't bother to correct him. He suddenly thought of the conversation in the general's mansion yesterday, and asked seriously, "Are cultivators really no match for the army?" Chun Pippi said, "More or less." Ning Ke shook his head and said, "But I don't believe it." Chun Pippi pointed at the wild geese that were like little black dots in the sky and said, "If there are tens of thousands of sharp arrows flying towards you like wild geese, what will you do? Use the no-boundary spirit of the academy to change the direction of the wind? Or use the great spirit of righteousness to fight against it? No matter how you fight against it, you will die." Ning Ke said, "With my cultivation, of course I can't. What about you?" Chun Pippi sighed and said, "If I can defeat the cavalry of the Tang Empire alone, I might as well change my name to headmaster of the academy." Ning Ke said, "When you were scared by second brother into the forest, you waved your sleeves and ran more than 100 feet away. You were so light and graceful. I think the arrows of the army can't hurt you." Chun Pippi said proudly, "Of course I am graceful." Then his face turned bitter and he said, "But you can't always be graceful. You can't eat being graceful. You have to stop to rest and meditate. How can you be graceful then?" Ning Ke was silent. Chun Pippi asked, "What are you thinking about?" Ning Ke said, "I am thinking whether you and second brother have violated the law of the Tang Empire." Chun Pippi was a little nervous and asked, "Why are you thinking about this?" Ning Ke said, "If you and second brother have violated the law of the Tang Empire, I will report it to the officials and let Su Shi deal with you." Chun Pippi said, "I don't care, but second brother is not afraid." Ning Ke said, "Su Shi said that even someone like second brother can be killed by his armored black cavalry." Chun Pippi sighed and said, "I didn't expect that the Defender General of the state also likes to brag. Let me explain a few words to you. I have read many of the book reviews. They are well written and their thinking is much deeper and more wonderful than mine. But for the story of Zhang Yi, I have reported it at the beginning. There will be joys and sorrows, and it will have its own world structure. But it must be simple, and I want to write it interesting so that everyone can be relaxed and happy. So it will not be so complicated. My ability is limited, and I really can't think of too complicated and novel a story. That's all. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 426. Ning Ke asked, "What do you mean?" Chun Pippi said, "Even if the armored cavalry is invincible, second brother has legs. Can't he run away?" Ning Ke said, "You just said that he can't run away. Me and second brother is second brother." Chun Pippi said, "He runs faster than me. I think even your big black horse can't catch up with him." Ning Ke suddenly thought of a question and said, The problem is, if second brother is surrounded by the army with his character, will he run away? Chun Pippi thought for a while and said, indeed he won't. Ning Ke said regretfully, it seems that no one can defeat 10,000 people. Chun Pippi shook his head and said, I think even if second brother is surrounded by 10,000 people, he won't run away. But he risked his life to kill 2,000 people, and the rest will naturally collapse. Ning Ke said, that makes sense. Then he sighed and said, such a scene makes me feel hot. It's a pity that I won't have the chance to see it. They chatted along the way and walked out of the meadow and forest. They came to the side of Vermilion Bird Avenue and were about to part. Ning Ke cupped his hands and bowed to him. He said sincerely, thank you, senior brother. Chun Pippi looked at him and sighed. Ning Ke was silent. Chun Pippi suddenly asked why. Ning Ke knew what he was asking about. Why did he kill people? Why did he fight against the Tang army? Why did he seem to be hostile to the general who had not returned yet? He looked down at the grass in front of his feet and remained silent. He would not admit anything in front of General Su Shi. In front of the world, he would definitely say that he was as clean as a little white flower. But he did not want to hide it from Chun Pippi. So he raised his head and looked into Chun Pippi's eyes. He said calmly, Xiahou killed my whole family. Hearing this answer, Chun Pippi was slightly shocked and his cheeks rippled. After a long silence, he reached out his chubby hand and patted his shoulder to comfort him. Then you do have a reason to be angry. Xiahou is not an ordinary person. There is no way for you to assassinate him. With your current level of cultivation, even if you think of something, you won't be able to assassinate him. Chun Pippi looked at Ning Ke and said worriedly, after all, he is a general of the Tang Empire and a visiting professor of West Hill. His status and influence are completely different. Even if the headmaster doesn't care about this matter, eldest brother definitely won't agree and second brother won't help you. I'm no match for Xiahou. Ning Ke understood his words and was greatly moved. Finally, Chun Pippi asked, what do you plan to do when Xiahou returns to Chang, and at the end of autumn? Ning Ke shook his head and answered, I don't know. Tang Imperial Palace. The palace, which had been washed by the rain for a day and a night, looked especially majestic and magnificent under the azure sky. Su Shi had been looking at this palace for decades. He was very familiar with it and was not tired of it. Just like his body now, although he was old and his old lung disease had not disappeared, he was still as tall and straight as when he first entered the military camp. He was still full of passion and attachment to the army. The emperor put down the bowl and frowned, seeming to dislike the bitterness. He waved his hand to signal the eunuch to leave and looked at the old general beside him. He said, although you and I both cough, our diseases are different. I can't give you this medicine. Speaking of which, I should let you rest in the south. Why do you insist on coming back? Su Shi was very grateful for His Majesty's trust in him and even his meticulous care, but it didn't mean that he agreed with all of His Majesty's actions. He said, the Nanxing Mountain tribe submitted their surrender last spring. It's already peaceful there. We can just leave some troops outside the forest to suppress Yueluan Kingdom. Why should I stay there? Although the humidity there is good for lung disease, I'm really not used to that kind of sticky air. The emperor said, fine. If you want to go back to Chang, and it's up to you. With you looking after the military ministry, I don't have to worry too much. Su Shi said, but I have to ask your majesty to worry more about this matter. The emperor was silent. Su Shi said, your majesty, please write a letter to the academy and ask the headmaster of the academy to punish Ning Quebec. The emperor turned to him and asked, do you have any evidence? Su Shi said no. The emperor asked again, what did you say when I wanted to punish Xiahou? Su Shi said, I didn't say anything. The emperor said, but my brother, the prime minister, the minister of the supreme judiciary, and even the empress said that it's written clearly in the law of the Tang Empire that it's not a crime without evidence. He looked at the most loyal old general of the Tang Empire and said in a self-mocking tone, I thought about it for several nights and didn't object. Neither did you. Are you going to object now? Su Shi was silent for a long time and then said, even if it's not a crime without evidence, I still insist that it's a terrible mistake to hand over the god-stunning array to Ning Quebec. You and Yensei have been friends for many years. The emperor frowned slightly and said, "Why don't you trust his successor?" Su Shi didn't explain further and just said stubbornly, "I don't trust him to take over Chang," and the emperor pondered for a moment and said, "I trust Ning Quebec." In the old brush pen shop in the early morning, Sang Sang got up early as usual, but she didn't chop firewood, boil water, and buy breakfast as usual. She looked at Ning Kei, who was sleeping soundly, and quietly pushed the door open. She walked to the front berth and squatted down to rummage in a deep drawer under the display shelf for a long time. Then she took out a neatly arranged package. The package was made of blue floral cloth. She just bought it yesterday. She didn't know what was inside, but judging from the way she held the package carefully, it should be very precious. She walked out of the old brush pen shop and boarded the horse carriage that she had arranged yesterday. She went to the House of Red Sleeves. As the most luxurious and romantic place in the world, the House of Red Sleeves was full of nobles. It was elegant and clean, but it was still a romantic place. It didn't close at midnight, so there was no reason to open the door early in the morning to welcome guests. Therefore, when Sang Sang got off the horse carriage with the package, both the front and side doors of the House of Red Sleeves were closed. The street was quiet and there was no one. Only the sound of sweeping could be heard from afar. Sang Sang looked around to make sure that no one noticed her. After the horse carriage left, she ran to the side door of the House of Red Sleeves. Before she knocked on the door, the corner of the door was opened and Xiao Cao's face appeared. The two maidservants looked very nervous, as if they were thieves. However, Xiao Cao didn't need to use any secret signals or exchange pleasantries. Xiao Cao welcomed her in. Dewdrop, who used to be the most popular girl in the brothel in Chang, had turned over a new leaf. Although the chicken soup calligraphy's copying business was not as good as before, she still had a great fortune. Moreover, someone on Lin 47th Street had already made an agreement with Mistress Jian for the sake of the dignity of his sect. Dewdrop still lived in the House of Red Sleeves. Every day she would read, play the guqin, or play in Chang'an City. When she was free, she would teach the kabuki. She lived a happy life. She still slept late and woke up late. Usually, she would not get up until noon, which was no different from previous years. But today before dawn, she got up from the bed and dressed herself with the help of the maidservant. Then she sat at the table with her hands on her cheeks, waiting for someone to come. The maidservant looked at her, suppressing her tiredness and yawning. She wondered what kind of important person she was waiting for. If Mistress Jian or the person on Lin 47th Street knew about it, there would be big trouble. The door was pushed open. Sang Sang walked in, but Xiao Cao stayed outside. Dewdrop looked at the blue floral package in Song Song's arms. Her eyes suddenly brightened. She stood up and asked, "You are so bold. You even dare to come alone." Sang Sang put the package on the table and said, "If he really asks about its origin, you can tell him that I stole it." The sky was getting brighter. A small sedan with green curtain left the House of Red Sleeves and came to the lake in the south of the city. The lake was quiet, and there was a restaurant named Victory House. The name of the restaurant was written by the libationer himself. It was the most noble restaurant in Chang'an City. Opposite the restaurant, there was a house with black eaves and green tiles. It was quiet and beautiful. It was called Stone House, which specialized in selling antiques and calligraphy. It was said that it was owned by the same owner as Victory House. Compared to the Victory House, the Stone House was much less famous. Only a few people in Chang'an knew about it. However, all the rich nobles and tycoons knew that this humble house was the place where antiques, famous calligraphers, and painters gathered the most in the world. The small sedan didn't stop in front of Stone House. Instead, it was led into the inner yard by a steward respectfully. Dewdrop walked out of the sedan with the blue floral package in her arms. The boss of Stone House welcomed her in the yard in person. He was very gentle and polite. Being able to establish Victory House and Stone House, the boss was not an ordinary person. He had a powerful background. Although Dewdrop used to be a famous girl in Chang'an City, she knew that her status was far from the boss's. The only reason why she was treated so politely was because of the package in her arms. She didn't say anything more. She put the package in her arms on the table. The boss of Stonehouse looked at the blue floral cloth used in the package. He could tell that it was a cheap thing at first glance. He couldn't help but be stunned. How could there be someone in the world who used such coarse cloth to carry such precious things? Thinking of this, he became a little vigilant. However, thinking of the rubbings from the woman in front of him and the rumors in the calligraphy and painting industry, he finally decided to take a gamble. Dewdrop looked at the boss of Stonehouse in front of her and suppressed her nervousness. She said softly, 10 days. I'll wait for your good news in the House of Red Sleeves. The boss frowned slightly and said, Miss Dewdrop, you should be very clear that we have to bear a lot of responsibility for this kind of business. It's the servants. Don't talk to me about the commission. Dewdrop smiled and said, I'm just an errand girl. There's no need for you to talk to me about this. Moreover, we all know what it means to Stonehouse if these things are sold to the world through your hands. Not to mention the commission, I really want to collect some money from you on behalf of that person. Hearing this, the boss knew that Dewdrop was a transparent person. He said with a smile, after the business is done, I will naturally reward Miss Dewdrop. What I said earlier was really unnecessary. Dewdrop sat in the small green curtained sedan and left. The boss dismissed all his subordinates, leaving only the old boss of Stonehouse, who was of good character and prestige. The old boss looked at the blue floral package and said with a slightly trembling voice, Is it really that person's authentic work? The boss said with emotion, If not for the guarantee, I wouldn't have to put up such a big show. The old boss thought of the few great appraisers in the calligraphy and painting industry in the side yard and thought that it was true. He looked at the blue floral package and sighed while stroking his beard. Sir Ning is such a distinguished person, but the little handmaiden in his house is so greedy. It's really sad. I even feel that it's not worth it for him. That's all for today. Tomorrow is a rest. Have a good weekend. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 427. Cultivators and ordinary people belong to two different worlds. Therefore, even with the knife at the side door of the academy, Ning Kei's status in the hearts of the Tang still mainly came from his status as a great calligrapher. In the hearts of professionals like the old shopkeeper, Sir Ning's status was even more prominent. Because of his respect and admiration for Ning Kei, the shopkeeper was very disdainful of the little handmaiden, even though he could only get the package with the blue flower cloth through the little handmaiden. In the old shopkeeper's eyes, the little handmaiden stole the master's property, which was really immoral. The shopkeeper thought for a moment. He disdained the little handmaiden's behavior and could not resist the temptation of money. He asked in a low voice, since the little handmaiden stole it, she would not dare to report it to the authorities or let Sir Ning know even if we took it. Why don't we? If you don't want to die, stop thinking about it. Hearing the shopkeeper's words, the boss of the stone house frowned slightly and warned sternly, Don't talk about it in the future. I heard that the little handmaiden has a special status and has a good relationship with the princess. Also, from the House of Red Sleeves, Sir Ning treats the handmaiden differently. Even if she was taken in by Sir Ning, the little handmaiden is just a greedy girl. She is not worthy of someone like Sir Ning. The shopkeeper suddenly thought of something and said, Boss, Sir Ning is not an ordinary calligrapher. Will there be any problems if we sell them secretly? The shopkeeper said, The little handmaiden is very favored and Sir Ning's seals are all kept by her. We have already obtained the sales documents, so these are not stolen goods. Even if Sir Ning finds out about this in the future, he can only blame the little handmaiden. According to the law of the Tang Empire, we are not responsible. The shopkeeper praised, Boss, your way of doing things is really reassuring. The shopkeeper picked up the blue flower cloth package and asked, Are they all in the side yard? The shopkeeper nodded. The west yard of the stone house was hidden behind the main 3-story building, and under the 9-turn green tree. The lake breeze was gentle and quiet here. Several men walked out of the room and greeted. Among these men, some were from the Song Kingdom, some from the South Jin Kingdom, and some from Yongguan of the Tang Empire. One of them was a master craftsman from the auspicious ink shop in Chang'an. They were all the leading figures in the appraisal of calligraphy and paintings in their respective countries. Yes, no matter whether they were gray-haired or indifferent, they all looked proud and confident. "Brother Emosher, you actually came too? Brother Jiefu. Who's that silent man under the grape trellis? He looks familiar. I think I met him once in the Yu Kingdom's imperial palace the year before last." As they exchanged their identities, the pride and confidence in these people's eyes gradually turned into astonishment. This was because they discovered that the reputation and status of the other people in the courtyard were not inferior to their own in the industry. Many of them had been famous for a long time, but they had never seen them before. They did not expect that they would all meet in this small courtyard today. Brother Emosher stroked his beard and said emotionally, "Stone House has been doing well these past few years. They managed to invite so many of us over in such a short time." The old man called Brother Jiefu shook his head and said emotionally, "If not for the fact that the items being sold this time are too rare and precious, you and I would not have gathered here." When the details of the sale were mentioned, the few men, including the silent man under the grape trellis, stood closer. They lowered their voices and began to discuss. At the same time, they wanted to see how much the other party knew about this matter. "How many scrolls are there in existence today?" "No one knows the exact number. We only know that the imperial study in the imperial palace has the most. I heard that His Majesty took more than half of them from the old brush pen shop." Brother Emosher said bitterly, "They are hidden in the dark imperial study. No one can see them, appreciate them, or see them. The people cannot get close to them. This is really..." He wanted to criticize the Tang Emperor for going against the grain. However, even though Chang'an's politics were clear, he did not dare to say it. The manors of the Chancellor and Grand Secretary Wang each have a few copies. The other manors should have about 4 more. However, these old men have hidden them in their manors. They are even more secretive than His Majesty. They don't show them to others easily. There are many rubbings of the chicken soup calligraphy, but no one has seen the original. It is rumored that it is in Grand Secretary Wang's mansion. Before everyone became famous, some lucky people bought some authentic works at Lin 47th Street. They were sold for a very high price in the past year. Most of them disappeared after changing hands twice. There are about 12 scrolls in total. I wonder how many scrolls the Stone House got this time. Is there a central section? A central section? Not even a wide one. If it is a calligraphy section, it must be more than 3. Otherwise, the owner of the Stone House would not have spent so much money to invite all of us here. The calligraphy appraisers discussed heatedly. Just then, the courtyard door was pushed open. The boss of the Stone House walked in with a blue floral cloth package. The crowd followed the boss back to the flower hall. Their eyes never left the blue floral cloth package in his hand. They were puzzled but also full of anticipation. The boss gently placed the blue floral cloth package on the table. He stretched out his hand and gestured for them to enter. The old shopkeeper brought 2 of his trusted subordinates with water and towels. The calligraphy and painting appraisers immediately surrounded him. With the fastest speed and the most meticulous attitude, they washed their hands clean and dried them with towels. Then they took the oil-absorbent tissue paper that the shopkeeper handed over and carefully soaked up the remaining water and oil on their fingers. Then they gathered around the blue-patterned package. The middle-aged man called Brother Emosher rolled up his sleeves and raised his hands. He looked at the coarse blue floral cloth package and said unhappily, "When did the Stone House become so shabby? Wrapping it in a cloth, not to mention the fact that it would harm the calligraphy section inside. Just the smell alone would be extremely foul." The boss of the Stone House could not afford to offend such a professional who had spent his life appreciating books. However, the professional habits they had developed made them unable to tolerate the scene in front of them. The boss of the Stone House smiled bitterly and did not explain. He reached out to untie the blue floral cloth package, revealing a slightly flat square box inside. The box was also made of coarse cardboard. Brother Emosher became even more displeased. He reached out to open the box, and then his body froze beside the table. The entire reception hall became silent. The appraisers looked at the paper in the box and were shocked speechless. They felt their eyes blur. After a moment, someone exclaimed in disbelief, 7 pieces. The boss walked to the side and sat down. He picked up his teacup and took a sip. He smiled and said, "Take a look first." The appraisers gathered around the table and carefully took out the calligraphy sections from the box. They were all the best in the industry. It did not take long for them to confirm that the 7 sections in the box were all authentic. Even though there were some doubts about the date of the sections, everyone thought that they were newly written. However, this did not affect the value of the sections. Thus, the appraisers were very shocked. They had not expected the stone house to spend so much. It could even be said that other than the imperial study of the Tang Imperial Palace, there was no other place where one could see so many authentic pieces of calligraphy. What shocked them the most was the section at the bottom of the box. To them it was a crumpled piece of paper. But in their eyes, that piece of paper was even more valuable than the legendary Shishan Su. Because there was the word chicken soup on the paper. Even though it should be authentic, but everyone knows that the original copy of the chicken soup calligraphy was bought by Grand Secretary Wang for 4,000 liang of silver. It is now hidden in the scholar's mansion. Brother Emosher frowned and said, "Is this a new copy?" The people around the table frowned and thought that there was indeed something wrong with this. Brother Emosher carefully pinched the 2 corners of the paper and held it up to the sunlight outside the reception hall. He wanted to see what was wrong with it. An appraiser from the Kingdom of Song standing opposite him suddenly exclaimed and pointed at the paper. He said, "There are words." Everyone looked at the back of the paper. There was indeed a line of beautiful small words. "This is real. Who wrote this?" The appraiser from the Kingdom of Song was confused and even angry. Even if this chicken soup calligraphy is a new copy, it is still an extremely valuable work. How can someone write on the back so casually? Brother Emosher shook his head and looked at the small words. He said emotionally, "Other than Sir Ning, who else can write such good words? If it was written by him, not only would it not ruin its value, but it would add color." Is this the original copy of the chicken soup calligraphy? With Sir Ning's signature, it is naturally the original copy. Then the one that Grand Secretary Wang bought at a high price? The one from Grand Secretary Wang's house is naturally fake. Everyone was silent. Even though they were not cultivators, they had all heard of the legendary story of the chicken soup calligraphy. Especially as the rubbings of the chicken soup calligraphy spread throughout the world, many people thought that in terms of value, the chicken soup calligraphy was almost as valuable as the blooming flowers calligraphy in the imperial study. Someone murmured in shock, "How much should this be worth?" Back then, Sir Wang bought it for 4,000 taels of silver. It was said to be a friendship fake, and at that time, Sir Wang's reputation was just beginning. The man who had been silent under the grape trellis in the courtyard and was still silent after entering the reception hall suddenly said, "Give it some time to advertise. It is best to anger Grand Secretary Wang's residence." The man raised his head and looked at the owner of the stone house and the appraisers. He said, 30,000. I sold this chicken soup calligraphy. If it is less than 30,000, I will be too ashamed to face anyone." As he said this, the silent man no longer looked dull. He looked extremely confident and proud, as if he had pulled out a cold sharp blade from a rusty scabbard. Everyone finally recognized who this silent man was. This man was the most famous seller in the calligraphy and painting industry. Very good. The owner of the stone house stood up and suddenly remembered Dewdrop's words. After thinking for a moment, he looked at the seller and said, "But there is a rule that needs to be written. Sir Ning has the right to choose the buyer." The man frowned slightly because he had rarely heard of such a request. The owner did not explain too much. The reason why he did this was because the origins of the 7 calligraphy sections were somewhat dishonorable. Even though the stone house did not have to bear any responsibility according to the law of the Tang Empire, if this matter were to be exposed, the stone house had to be prepared for the calligraphy sections to be taken back. Writing such a rule in advance was firstly to give Sir Ning face. Secondly, the sale was invalid. And it was also to appease the big shots who were qualified to buy the calligraphy sections. I don't know why I feel so uncomfortable. Maybe it's because of my laziness. I'll only write 1 chapter today and 3 chapters tomorrow. If I don't pressure myself, I'm useless. Damn. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 428. The kitchen of the old brush pen shop was filled with the fragrance of vegetables. Ning-Kei stood behind Sang-Sang and finally couldn't help asking, "Does anyone suspect that I sold them myself?" Sang-Sang didn't turn around and said, "I heard that they all thought I sold them secretly. I'm really sorry to let you bear the reputation of being a thief," Ning-Kei said shamefully. Sang-Sang glanced at the green tofu pudding in the pot and closed the stove with her little foot. She put the tofu pudding into the bowl and said, "Young master, it's okay as long as it can be sold for a good price." Ning-Kei took over the increasingly heavy bowl and said, "I hope so. Recently, there was a secret rumor in the calligraphy and antique shop in Chang, and that 7 sections of calligraphy from the old brush pen shop were going to be sold. It was said that these 7 sections were from a greedy handmaiden. Of course, that was not the truth. 6 out of the 7 sections were written by Ning-Kei on a certain night, and he was the one who wanted to sell them. The reason why he took such a roundabout way to involve Dewdrop, and even let Sang-Sang bear the reputation of a greedy seller was mainly because of 3 reasons. First, Ning-Kei didn't want anyone to know that he needed a large sum of money now because he didn't want others to know what he was going to do with the money. Second, as a first-class or even super-class calligrapher, selling his own works was a very shameful thing no matter how one looked at it. The third point was the most important. If he wanted to sell his calligraphy sections in public, the emperor in the palace would definitely borrow them or buy them at the official price, even though his words were gentle and he was shameless. The emperor had never returned the sections borrowed from the old brush pen shop. As for the official price, it couldn't meet Ning-Kei's current needs. That was why he came up with this idea. Sang-Sang cut some pickled mustard and used chopsticks to put it on the green tofu pudding. She asked, "Do you want sesame oil?" Ning-Kei shook his head and said, "The corners of my mouth are burning. I'd better eat something light." Sang-Sang used her slender fingertips to pick up a small handful of sesame seeds and sprinkled them evenly into the tofu pudding. She asked, "Yesterday I did the calculation with Mr. Chi again. The amount of money is still not enough. Will the 7 sections be less? No matter how precious an item is, if too much of it is released at once, its price will drop. Just like Chinjinji Cosmetic Store's cosmetics, if it was everywhere on the streets, why would it be so expensive?" Ning-Kei said, "I was worried that if I put all 7 sections on the market at once, it would ruin the market price. Now it seems that the stone house is indeed capable." Holding the tofu pudding bowl, Sang-Sang's eyes glowed as she said, "I wonder how much this can be sold for." Ning-Kei said, "The first 6 sections can be sold at least 8 or 10,000 yuan, right? The most important thing is that last chicken soup calligraphy. I don't know how much it will sell for." Sang-Sang asked doubtfully, "Is that chicken soup calligraphy the original?" Ning-Kei nodded and looked at the array pestle that was placed in an inconspicuous corner of the display rack. He said, "The chicken soup calligraphy has always been wrapped on the pestle that my master asked you to pass to me." Then he sighed and said, "My master is an old liar. I am very touched." This sentence was both a tease and a sigh. It was mostly because of his conversation with General Su Shi a few days ago. Su Shi insisted that Master Yen Sei was a righteous person. Now that it was proven that his late master was indeed a troublemaker, Ning-Kei could not help but feel gratified. Sang-Sang said worriedly, "I'm just worried that old scholar Wang will be angry." Ning-Kei laughed and said, "He wants to buy the chicken soup calligraphy from my master with 4,000 taels of silver. Who else would my master lie to if not Lord Wang?" Sang-Sang said, "But a lie is still a lie." Ning-Kei thought for a moment and asked, "Have you found out?" Sang-Sang said, "Old scholar Wang was originally from Qing. In Chuan County, the clan has been planning to rebuild the ancestral temple and the genealogy. The Grand Secretary's mansion has been leading this matter, and has been preparing for a few days. After eating the vegetable and bean curd porridge, Ning Ke rubbed his stomach and got on the horse carriage to the Grand Secretary's mansion. It was not Zheng Jing, the Grand Secretary of the Imperial Library, who lived in the Grand Secretary's mansion, but Wang Shichen, the Grand Secretary of 3 dynasties. Grand Secretary Wang Shichen's seniority and prestige were not comparable to that of Grand Secretary Zheng. Compared to him, his temper was also much worse than that of Zheng Jing. In the quiet study, old scholar Wang looked at Ning Ke in front of him. His slightly turbid eyes were spitting flames of anger. He did not care about Ning Ke's identity as a student of the 2nd floor of the academy at all. He shouted harshly, "When you were in my mansion, you stamped the chicken soup calligraphy in front of everyone. Why is there another chicken soup calligraphy now? I don't care whether it was your handmaiden who stole it or not. I just want to know why there is another chicken soup calligraphy." Ning Ke suddenly regretted it. After a long silence, he said with a bitter smile, "I did not know about this before I got the relic of my late master. I was drunk when I wrote the note in the House of Red Sleeves that night, so I did not recognize that it was a copy of my late master's in the Grand Secretary's mansion. I really did not expect him to have such an elegant hobby." "Elegant hobby? How is that elegant hobby?" Wang Shichen's white hair fluttered in the wind. He was so angry that he could not vent his anger. He waved his trembling hands and roared angrily, "That day when I went to the Southern Gate Temple to stop him, he took out the chicken soup calligraphy from his sleeves. How is this elegant hobby? He was obviously prepared to cheat me of my money in advance." Ning Ke smiled and corrected him. "My late master must have never thought that you would be the one to be cheated." Then he said seriously, "Since that chicken soup calligraphy is a copy of my master's, it is naturally very precious. Moreover, he has already passed away, so please do not blame him anymore." Grand Secretary Wang sneered and did not reply. Ning Ke suddenly asked, "I heard that your family is rebuilding the ancestral hall." Grand Secretary Wang's expression changed slightly and he nodded. "With your prestige, the horizontal board of the ancestral hall will naturally be inscribed by His Majesty. However, do you still need someone to write the inscription tablet in the genealogy?" Ning Ke asked. Grand Secretary Wang was startled, and then he understood Ning Ke's meaning. He could not help but be overjoyed. Although the chicken soup calligraphy was precious, for a large family that inherited poetry and books, the ancestral hall and the genealogy were related to the inheritance of the family. It was something to be passed on to the future generations. It would be wonderful if Ning Ke could inscribe it himself. "Thank you very much. Then I will not stand on ceremony." Grand Secretary Wang laughed and then he changed the topic and asked, "Since the calligraphy was taken by Miss Sang to sell, are you going to take it back the day after tomorrow?" As an elder statesman of the Tang Empire for 3 dynasties, he naturally knew the news that Zheng Jing had reunited with his daughter. Therefore, the Grand Secretary was angry about the 7 calligraphy of the old brush pen shop, and had always had a deep doubt. At this time he asked in front of Ning Quebec. Ning Ke smiled and did not answer. Grand Secretary Wang understood what he meant and said with a serious expression, "If that is the case, then I will go and buy the chicken soup calligraphy back. Will Sir Ning mind?" With a bigwig like Grand Secretary Wang entering the auction, the 7 calligraphy sections would definitely be sold at a very good price. Ning Ke only had money in his eyes and did not mind at all. He immediately smiled. Chu Yuxian got off the horse carriage and looked at the people walking towards the stone house. His expression changed slightly and he said with a trembling voice, "My father is indeed rich, but there are many people richer than him in Chang'an. Those people are royal merchants from the South City. Are you expecting me to compete with them?" Chu Yuxian's father was Master Chu, one of the 7 aristocrats in the eastern city. He was a famous wealthy merchant in Chang, and An was famous for being cultured. Therefore, the stone house had sent an invitation to Master Chu for the 7 calligraphy of the old brush pen shop. This invitation was naturally kept in Chu Yuxian's sleeve. Ning Ke had followed Chu Yuxian to the stone house. He was not too interested in the auction of his own calligraphy sections, But to ensure that there would be no problems and that he would be able to get the money, he had decided to come personally. Chu Yuxian looked at Ning Ke beside him with a worried expression. After his father had received the invitation, he had started to ask around about today's events and vaguely knew that the old brush pen shop had been robbed. Since they were selling stolen goods from the old brush pen shop today, Ning Ke had insisted on coming to take a look. It could only be that he wanted to cause trouble or buy it back with money. But no matter what, it sounded a little dangerous. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Ning Ke explained. "I'm afraid that someone will cause trouble." Chu Yuxian did not understand his words. He thought of his father's ecstasy when he found out about his relationship with Ning Quebec. He did not care about what would happen next and walked towards the stone house. After showing the invitation, a pretty maid led the two into the courtyard. The stone house was located by the quiet lake. The warm lake breeze of late spring passed through the willows by the lake and through the quiet corridors and halls. When they entered the courtyard, it was already much cooler. The auction was held in a 3-story wooden building. The building was divided into 3 sides, and only the side facing the lake had no buildings. It was wide and open, and there was a platform in the middle of the building. There was nothing on the platform except for a large, elegant screen. A calligraphy section was embroidered on the screen with golden thread, but it was hard to tell who it was from a distance. The clear lake breeze blew in from outside the building, gently brushing against the screen and slowly passing through the pavilions. The heat that had just arisen disappeared immediately. In the gentle breeze, the extremely simple layout would make even the most vulgar person feel a sense of elegance at a glance. There were more than 20 individual pavilions on the 3rd floor. The entrances of the pavilions were partitioned by gauze bamboo. When the lake breeze blew, the gauze fluttered, revealing the bamboo bone curtains at the back. One could vaguely see the feet, but it was impossible to see what kind of person was sitting inside. It not only made the people in the pavilions feel comfortable, but also protected their privacy. Ning Ke and Chu Yuxian were led by the pretty maid to a pavilion on the 2nd floor. They sat down and looked at the clear screen on the platform in the building. They thought to themselves that they had made the right choice in choosing the stone house. There was too little time between receiving the 7 calligraphy pieces from the old brush pen shop, starting the publicity, and today's official auction. There was not enough time to spread the news to the South Jin Kingdom and the other countries. Those foreign merchants also did not have the time to attend the event. The boss of the stone house could not help but feel a little regretful. He thought to himself that he should not have asked the appraiser to come over when he first received the news from the old brush pen shop. He should have just spread the news. However, the 7 calligraphy pieces from the old brush pen shop, especially the chicken soup calligraphy, was too attractive. Even though the merchants from the South Jin Kingdom and the other countries did not have the time to attend the event, the envoys from the other countries and 2 or 3 royal merchants who lived in Chang and all year round came. From their expressions, it seemed that they were really interested. There were countless whispers in the pavilion of the stone house. No one doubted the credibility of the stone house, and naturally no one doubted the authenticity of the 7 calligraphy pieces. These buzzing discussions were probably about whether or not to bid, and to analyze the strength of the competitors. As a middle-aged man in a simple green robe walked up to the platform, the discussions in the stone house gradually subsided. When the middle-aged man gently tapped the golden chime tablet in his hand, it became even more quiet. "This is the boss of the stone house?" Ning Ke asked. Chu Yuxian shook his head and pointed at the man downstairs with his folding fan. He said, "This person's surname is Zhong and his given name is Li. It is said that he is from a branch of the Zhong family in Yangguan. He had some problems with his family and was unable to become an official for many years. That was why he left Yangguan in anger and started this business. He has been working in the auction house of the Kingdom of Song all these years. Many people think that he is the best seller. Since the stone house has made such a big event today, we naturally have to invite him." When Ning Ke heard the Zhong family in Yangguan, he naturally thought of Zhong Dejun. He could not help but laugh. He said, "I hope this person is not as boring as Zhong Dejun." Chu Yuxian laughed. "Not everyone from the Zhong family in Yangguan is useless." Zhongli stood on the platform and calmly looked around at the 3 pavilions around him. Even though it was a simple glance, the people in the pavilions felt that he was looking at them. Just this move alone was enough to show the skills of a seller. Then, contrary to everyone's expectations, the seller did not introduce the history of the stone house like normal auctions, nor did he greet the bigwigs in the pavilions. Instead, he spoke directly. His voice was calm and his expression was neither servile nor overbearing. There was even a hint of pride in his voice. Today is the 84th day of spring. It is the time for the golden jade nectar to hit the market. Everyone says that gold is common and jade is pure. However, jade is also common today. Today, I invite all of you to admire the most elegant item in the world, the beauty of 1,000 years of ink fragrance. Zhongli smiled and said, "You may be a little disappointed. Today's event does not have a prelude, nor will there be any other famous calligraphy sections. Just as gold is a common object before jade, what other calligraphy sections in the world are not common objects before the 7 sections of the old brush pen shop?" Hearing this, the nobles and businessmen in the pavilions of the stone house gasped in shock. This was because the 7 sections from the old brush pen shop were too highly praised. However, after thinking about it carefully, the people in the pavilions had to admit that even though this was a move by the stone house to raise its own status, they could not be faulted. This was because in today's world, not to mention the calligraphy masters of the past, even the works of the old masters and the works of the master of calligraphy could not compare to the glory of the old brush pen shop. As Chu Yuxian listened to the discussions and praises in the pavilion, his eyes brightened and his expression became more and more proud. He gently fanned himself and stole glances at Ning Ke from time to time. He thought to himself, if you know that the owner of the old brush pen shop is sitting right next to me, won't you die of jealousy? Damn it. Even Chuang County is prohibited. Chapter 2 will definitely be out before 11 o'clock. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. You're tuning in to the Li Mei Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.